The silence in the Kagu ancestral estate's courtyard was absolute, heavier than the reinforced shields shimmering overhead. We stood amidst the gathered might of Earth's defenders, 9 peak radiance, Alice, Tiamat's imposing projection. Yet the atmosphere was thick with the chilling residue of Alisara's contemptuous withdrawal. Her dismissal, her sheer disappointment, echoed louder than any threat. Suspended in the air before me, where the last vestiges of her oppressive presence had lingered, hung the impossible letter. Ancient parchment, sealed with the strange crest of a sightless tree and a watchful eye, pulsed with a faint, internal golden light. It felt alien, yet undeniably directed, a final, deliberate message left in her wake. "What is that?" Ren asked, his voice low, cautious. He stepped closer, his body tense. His god's eyes narrowed in intense concentration, attempting to pierce the letter's veil. After a moment, a frown creased his usually serene features. "I cannot see into it. There is a conceptual interference. It resists observation, actively." Lucifer moved beside him, his own potent perception focused on the enigmatic object. His crowns of light and shadow flickered erratically as he probed its nature. "Same here," he confirmed, frustration tightening his voice. "It is shielded, not with conventional energy wards, but with intent. Pure, focused, divine-level intent. Like trying to read thoughts behind a locked door. Their powerful gifts met an unyielding wall, but I felt something different. Not sight, not understanding in the conventional sense. It was resonance. The letter felt like an extension of Alisara herself, a lingering fragment of her will purposefully left behind, tuned specifically to me. It communicated its origin, its purpose, through a subtle, directed vibration that resonated within my own core. It wanted me to open it. It wanted to deliver its final word. Alisara, I thought, the single quote a cold, hard certainty. Always needing the last word. Even her departures are calculated moves. Reaching out, I felt a faint, almost imperceptible resistance, like pushing through thick, charged air, before my fingers closed around the surprisingly solid parchment. The soft golden light emanating from it faded the moment I took hold. The parchment felt cool, smooth, yet pulsed with a barely contained power that prickled against my senses. A dangerous energy held in delicate stasis. "Arthur, be careful," Alice cautioned, her voice quiet but sharp. Tiamat's projection shifted slightly, her draconic eyes narrowed in suspicion. "It's from her?" I stated simply, meeting the worried gazes of my family. A final message, it seems. There was no point delaying. Whatever barb she had left, whatever psychological blow she intended, it was better faced now, together. With the eyes of everyone in the courtyard fixed upon me. My fiancés tense with apprehension, Lucifer and Ren wary, Alice and Tiamat radiating cautious readiness. I carefully broke the strange, serpentine tree seal. The ancient wax crumbled not into dust, but into faint sparks of golden light. As the seal broke, the parchment didn't simply unfold or fall open. The internal golden light intensified dramatically, flaring outwards in a blinding, yet silent, pulse. The parchment itself dissolved instantly, transforming into a swirling cloud of shimmering golden motes. These motes coalesced rapidly in the air before us, weaving themselves together with impossible speed and precision, forming a translucent, life-sized projection of Alisara. She stood there, suspended a few feet above the ground, looking impossibly regal, serene, and utterly terrifying. She wore flowing crimson silks that seemed woven from solidified desire, rippling slightly as if stirred by an unfelt breeze. Her beauty was inhuman, flawless, yet devoid of any genuine warmth. Her eyes, pools of captivating darkness, held only a cold, possessive amusement as her gaze swept deliberately over the assembled group. Her attention lingered on me for a bare moment, a flicker of something calculating, perhaps reassessing in their depths, acknowledging the minor surprise of my earlier resilience. Then, with obvious, deliberate intent, her gaze dismissed me, sliding past to focus pointedly, individually, on the others gathered. My 6 fiancés, Lucifer, Rin. Her voice echoed, not through the air, but directly within their minds, bypassing mine entirely for a moment before I forced my perception to intercept the psychic broadcast. It was musical, seductive, yet carried the crushing weight of divine authority. To those who stand beside him, yet remain so fundamentally beneath. The projection began, a faint, condescending smile playing on her perfect lips. A warning, or perhaps, from my new perspective, merely a kindness. As she spoke, a wave of palpable pressure emanated from the projection. It was not a crude blast of energy, but a subtle, insidious exertion of conceptual weight, targeted with chilling precision at the 9 peak radiance surrounding me. My 6 fiancés, Lucifer and Rin. It bypassed Alice and Tiamat, perhaps deeming them irrelevant or simply focusing her demonstration. It was not a physical attack, just a casual flexing of her divine authority, like a giant lightly pressing a thumb against 9 carefully arranged insects to remind them of their fragility. The pressure felt less like force and more like the rules of reality subtly changing around them. Gravity becoming slightly heavier, air slightly thicker, their own internal energy flows meeting an inexplicable, viscous resistance. The effect was immediate, visceral. Luna flinched, her hands flying to her temples as her connection to the infinite lines of fate momentarily dissolved into chaotic static under the pressure. Seraphina's glacial aura, usually an unshakable fortress of cold, cracked visibly, fine lines spreading across its surface like stressed ice. Rachel gasped, her knuckles white where she gripped a nearby console for support, her analytical mind struggling against a wave of induced cognitive dissonance as simple physics seemed to waver. Cecilia's regal posture stiffened further, her jaw tightening as she refused to yield even an inch, though a faint tremor ran through her hands. Rose took an involuntary half-step back, her connection to life energy recoiling as if from something fundamentally profane and draining. Reika's hand tightened instinctively on her sword hilt, her body tensing into a combat stance that offered no defense against this kind of pervasive, environmental assault. Lucifer's crowns flared erratically, light and shadow warring violently as he actively fought the intrusion, pushing back with raw will. Ren's breath hitched, his usually serene face paling under the strain as his perception struggled to reconcile the conflicting signals reality was sending. They were peak radiance, beings capable of shaking continents, yet this casual, dismissive exertion of her projected will was enough to make them viscerally, humiliatingly aware of the unbridgeable abyss separating their power from hers. "He is mine," Alisara's projection continued, her cold gaze sweeping over their struggling forms again, utterly dismissive. "His path, his potential, his ultimate culmination, these are matters to be decided between him and I alone. You are distractions, children playing at godhood, clinging to his ankles in the deluded belief you offer support." Her smile widened slightly, becoming sharp, cruel, predatory. "Your power, even at this peak you've so laboriously achieved, is pathetic. An irrelevance measured against the truly divine. You believe you can fight alongside him? You cannot even withstand my idle thoughts without crumbling." The pressure intensified fractionally, forcing choked gasps from several of them. Sweat beaded on Lucifer's brow. Seraphina closed her eyes, focusing all her will on maintaining her integrity against the conceptual weight. "Consider this my final courtesy," the projected Alisara said, her voice turning sharp, cold as the void. "Stay back. Do not interfere in what is to come between Arthur and myself. This is a stage far too grand, far too subtle for your limited roles. Attempt to stand against me, attempt to protect him from his destiny with me." Her mental voice dripped with possessive certainty, "And you will simply die, pointlessly, annoyingly. You are not worthy to even witness the transformation he must undergo." Before I could react, before I could step forward and draw her focus back to me, she acted. Her warning was not just words. It was the prelude to another demonstration, another layer of her cruel lesson. As her final words echoed in their minds, she unleashed a different kind of power, not raw pressure, but a targeted conceptual attack woven from fantasy and control, aimed specifically, exclusively, at my 6 fiancés. And just so you understand the futility, her voice purred, laced with malice, allow me to offer you a glimpse into a world where you truly belong. Reality warped visibly around Rachel, Serafina, Cecilia, Rose, Reka, and Luna. The solid courtyard seemed to shimmer, dissolve. A wave of shimmering golden light, far more intense than the projection itself, pulsed outwards from Alisara's image, enveloping the 6 women completely. It was not an explosion. It felt like an invitation, a seductive, irresistible pull into a perfectly crafted illusion. Their eyes, which had been wide with strain and defiance, suddenly glazed over, losing focus. Their bodies went slack. One by one, they collapsed, not falling violently, but crumpling gently, as if succumbing to a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. Rachel slumped against the console. Serafina sank to her knees, then onto her side. Cecilia swayed, caught only by Reka, who then folded beside her. Rose simply sat down, her head lolling. Luna's form flickered before she too subsided onto the cold stone floor. Their physical bodies remained unconscious, their faces slack, utterly vulnerable, but their presence, the vibrant peak radiant auras that had moments before filled the courtyard with potent energy, vanished utterly, as if snuffed out by an invisible wind. Their minds, their consciousnesses, had been forcibly drawn away, pulled into the gilded cage Alisara had prepared, a psychic prison woven from fantasy and control. The golden light faded completely. The projection of Alisara lingered for a final, triumphant moment, her cold gaze meeting mine across the now devastated courtyard, where moments before stood 9 peak radiants ready to defend their world. Now only Lucifer, Ren, Alice, Tiamat's projection, and I remained standing amidst the still, unconscious forms of my fiancés. Her smile was absolute, utterly victorious, a silent testament to the effortless demonstration of her power. Lucifer let out a choked sound, a mixture of rage and disbelief, his crowns flaring wildly. Run took an involuntary step back, his god's eyes wide with horror, witnessing a level of conceptual manipulation far beyond even his enhanced perception. Alice's usual calm finally broke, her hands clenching into fists, a flicker of cold fury in her eyes. Tiamat's projection vibrated with barely suppressed draconic wrath. Then, with a final silent pulse that felt like a dismissive wave, Alisara's image dissolved, the golden motes vanishing utterly, leaving only the chilling echo of her warning and the terrifying, immediate reality of her power. The courtyard felt impossibly empty, the silence deafening, punctuated only by the shallow breathing of the 6 unconscious women lying helpless on the cold stone. Luna's eyes snapped open, not to the familiar Kagu courtyard, not to Arthur's concerned face, but to gray. Endless, featureless gray. A desolate, windswept gray shoreline stretched before her, meeting a churning sea the color of lead under a perpetually overcast sky. Salt spray kissed her face, cold and biting. Panic seized her instantly. She knew this place, or rather an agonizing echo of it. The conceptual space, the pocket dimension outside of normal causality, where Julius Slatemark, her first contractor, her dear companion, had sealed her away, protecting her from the backlash of his final, desperate act against a foe far beyond his measure. No, her mind screamed, not here, not again, please not again. Then she saw him. Arthur stood on the shoreline, facing away from her, looking out at the turbulent sea. He wore simple, dark clothing, stark against the gray landscape. There was a stillness about him, but it was not the calm strength she knew. It was a cold, desolate emptiness that seemed to absorb the meager light. He felt like part of this non-place, carved from the same conceptual gray, embodying the same quiet despair that had surrounded Julius's final sacrifice. Arthur. Her voice was a thin thread, nearly lost in the non-sound of the conceptual wind. He turned slowly, his movements lacking their usual fluid grace. His face was impossibly calm, His eyes, usually so full of warmth, determination, or even fierce anger, were cold, distant, holding only a chillingly familiar, pragmatic emptiness. It was the look Julius had worn when explaining the terrible necessity of sealing her away. "Luna," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the love, the connection that formed the bedrock of her existence. "It is necessary." "Necessary? What are you talking about? Where are we?" "We have to get back, Alisara." "Alisara is irrelevant to this decision," he interrupted calmly. "This is about managing variables, ensuring stability. Your nature, Luna, your fundamental connection to the tapestry of fate. It is an element of chaos I can no longer afford in the equation." Her blood ran cold. He sounds just like Julius did, rationalizing the unbearable sacrifice. But this time, it is me being sacrificed. "You see too much," Arthur continued, taking a deliberate step towards her, his presence radiating not warmth, but a cold, irrefutable logic. "You influence outcomes merely by observing them. You introduce unpredictable ripples into the causal stream simply by existing. In the face of a threat like Alisara, and what may come after, such unpredictability cannot be tolerated." What are you saying?" she whispered, dread turning her limbs to ice. "I am saying," he stated, his voice a quiet hammer blow against her heart, "that for the sake of the mission, for the integrity of the timeline required for victory, your unique influence must be neutralized, contained. Your perception makes you a potential anchor for paradox, a focal point for temporal instabilities. You are, forgive the term, a liability." Liability. The word struck her with the force of a physical impact. Julius had sealed her away believing he was the liability, sacrificing himself for her future. Arthur was sealing her away believing she was the liability, sacrificing her for his mission. He thought she was not strong enough, that her very nature was a weakness to be excised. The betrayal felt absolute, a cruel inversion of her past trauma, amplified tenfold by the depth of her love for him. "You can't," she pleaded, tears blurring the desolate gray landscape. "Arthur, please listen to me. Don't do this. My sight, our bond. We can fight her together." "Your sight is the problem," he stated, raising his hand. Gray energy, utterly cold, devoid of the subtle warmth of harmony, coalesced around his fingers. It felt sterile, absolute, a power focused solely on negation. He began to weave it into the conceptual space around her, not forming walls, but drawing lines of causal severance, intricate patterns that resonated with a profound, chilling finality. Seals, woven not from light or magic as Julius might have, but from pure, unraveling non-existence. He was methodically, precisely cutting her off, not just from the physical world, but from the very flow of fate, time, and possibility itself, just as Julius had done, but with cold calculation instead of loving sacrifice. "Arthur? No!" she screamed, raw power erupting from her, golden pure light exploding outwards in a desperate attempt to shatter the forming conceptual cage. But her light, usually so potent against non-divine forces, splashed harmlessly against the shimmering gray seals. They were not barriers to be broken by force. They were statements of ontological fact, reality itself agreeing with her imprisonment, urged on by his will. He looked at her, his expression still that unnerving mask of detached calculation. The man she loved was gone, replaced by this cold strategist who saw her only as a flawed variable. "Forgive me, Luna," he said again, the words utterly meaningless, devoid of genuine regret. "But victory requires certainty. You represent the opposite." The final seal began to form above her, a complex lattice of gray negation, designed to sever her connection to everything, to isolate her consciousness outside the normal bounds of time and causality forever. Absolute despair washed over her, suffocating, complete, trapped, again, betrayed by the one she trusted most, utterly helpless. Just as the final gray strand wove into place, completing the seal, locking her within a silent, timeless, fateless void. She felt it with every fiber of her being. A snap. It was not a sound in the gray emptiness. It was a profound, visceral severance originating from the deepest core of her soul. The bond, the unique, resonant connection forged between her Chelan essence and Arthur's spirit. The golden thread that had anchored her, defined her, given her purpose since the day they met, shattered, irrevocably, gone. And with its absolute disintegration came the immediate, soul-destroying certainty. Arthur was dead. Somewhere far away, beyond the unbreachable walls of her conceptual prison. Fighting the battle she should have been beside him for, he had fallen. He had died. And she, the being whose very essence was intertwined with the perception of fate, had been trapped here, blind, helpless, unable to foresee it, unable to prevent it, unable even to reach him in his final moments. Her greatest fear, the echo of Julius's protective sacrifice twisted into the ultimate betrayal and loss, realized in the most agonizing way imaginable. The universe went silent. Purpose dissolved into meaninglessness. There was only the gray emptiness, and the echoing, infinite void where his soul, her anchor, had been. Rekha opened her eyes. The transition was seamless, instantaneous. One moment she felt the psychic pull of Alisara's attack in the Kagu courtyard. The next she stood on familiar ground, or an unsettlingly perfect replica of it. A vast, minimalist training hall stretched before her. Sunlight streaming through high, arching windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the still air. Polished wooden floor, weapon racks lining one wall holding only simple, unadorned practice swords. It wasn't training ground Omega, nor any space within the Creighton estate. It felt older, imbued with a palpable aura of profound discipline, focus, and a reverence for the blade that resonated deep within her soul. Echoes, faint but distinct, of Magnus Drakar's legendary presence seemed to linger here, a standard she felt acutely, even though she had never met the man herself. Arthur stood opposite her, perhaps 10 yards away across the empty floor. But it wasn't Arthur, not the man she loved, the quiet pillar of strength whose trust was the foundation of her renewed life. This was Arthur the Master, the sole inheritor of Magnus' will. His face carved into lines of cold, profound, and utterly devastating disappointment. He held a simple wooden bakken, mirroring the one that suddenly felt alien and impossibly heavy in her own hand. "Again," he commanded, his voice sharp, devoid of any warmth or patience, echoing slightly in the vast, empty hall. Her body responded automatically, muscle memory honed by 2 relentless years of obsessive training taking over. She moved, flowing through a complex sequence from the sword art Arthur had painstakingly reconstructed for her from the hidden, higher-level notes within Magnus Drakar's manual, the sacred legacy he had chosen to entrust to her alone. Her form, practiced tens of thousands of times, should have been flawless. Her energy flow, now amplified to the peak radiant level alongside his, should have been seamless, the blade a perfect extension of her disciplined will. It felt perfect, the culmination of every drop of sweat, every ounce of effort she had poured into proving herself worthy. Arthur parried her strike with contemptuous, almost lazy ease. His bakken intercepted hers not with brute force, but with a subtle, infuriating precision that sent jarring, dissonant vibrations humming up her arm, highlighting a dozen microscopic flaws she hadn't even perceived. A fractional imbalance in her weight distribution, a millisecond delay in the rotation of her hips, a barely perceptible wavering of intent just nanoseconds before the intended impact. His simple, almost dismissive block didn't just stop her attack. It dissected it, laid bare its inherent weaknesses, its fundamental lack of true mastery. "Sloppy," he stated, his voice like chipping ice against granite. "Your foundation remains unstable. Your transitions are hesitant, lacking the absolute conviction required. You still fight like a student afraid to commit fully to the strike, perpetually holding back, afraid of the edge." Rekha faltered, the unexpected, brutal critique striking deep into the core of her being, targeting her lifelong pursuit of perfection, of absolute, unwavering discipline. She had pushed herself beyond exhaustion, dedicated every waking moment to mastering this art, to honoring the trust he had placed in her. Do you even comprehend the weight of the legacy you presume to carry? Arthur interrupted, his cold gaze unwavering, gesturing dismissively first at the Bacchen trembling slightly in her hand, then at the intangible, yet palpable, presence of Magnus Dracar that seemed to fill the hall like unspoken judgment. His art, his philosophy, it is not a mere collection of techniques to be drilled into muscle memory. Reika, it is a state of being, a commitment to absolute precision, absolute finality, absolute truth expressed through the blade. And you? He paused, letting the weight of his disappointment settle upon her like a physical burden. You treat it like a ceremonial robe, worn for show, far too large and heavy for your inadequate frame. His words were not just criticism. They were targeted, psychological barbs, each one striking precisely at her deepest, most guarded insecurities. Her entire existence, since the moment Arthur had pulled her back from the brink of oblivion, had been a quiet, relentless quest to prove herself worthy of his trust, worthy of the second chance at life he had inexplicably granted her, worthy of the monumental legacy of the martial king, a man she revered as a symbol of ultimate martial attainment but had never known personally. The fear of failing that implicit trust, of being found fundamentally wanting despite her absolute dedication, was a constant, gnawing shadow beneath her calm, disciplined exterior. "I am doing my best," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her usual iron composure beginning to fracture under the unexpected, brutal assault from the person whose opinion mattered more than any other. "Your best is demonstrably insufficient," Arthur snapped, his voice echoing harshly in the suddenly cold, cavernous hall. "Potential is meaningless without flawless execution. Discipline without true understanding is merely mimicry. I pulled you back from despair. I gave you purpose where there was none. I placed my own master's sacred art, his very soul expressed through the blade, into your hands." His voice dropped, laced with a chilling finality. "Believing mistakenly, it seems, that you possessed the necessary discipline, the unwavering spirit, the innate capacity to embody its truth." He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound, weary disappointment that cut deeper than any physical blow could have. "It appears I vastly overestimated you. Saving you, entrusting you with this, it was a mistake. A mistake." The phrase resonated in the hollow space that suddenly opened within her chest, shattering her carefully constructed sense of self-worth, her entire reason for being. He regretted saving her. He believed she had failed him, failed Magnus, failed everything. The years of tireless effort, the sacrifices, the pain, all rendered meaningless by this single, devastating judgment. As if summoned by the sheer, crushing weight of her despair, a small figure appeared silently at the edge of the training floor. Stella, older now, perhaps 15, her face holding none of its usual bright, insatiable curiosity, only a cold, assessing distance that mirrored Arthur's own. She looked Reika up and down, her gaze lingering on the Bacchen in Reika's trembling hand with something akin to disdain, then met Reika's desperate, pleading eyes. "You failed him," Stella stated, her voice chillingly flat, devoid of any childish warmth or affection. "You couldn't even live up to Master Magnus' memory, someone you never even knew. And you failed Daddy." She took a small, deliberate step backward, physically distancing herself, as if Reika were something contaminated, something broken beyond repair. Her next words were delivered with brutal, surgical precision. "You are not my mommy anymore." The simple, declarative sentence struck Reika with the force of an executioner's blade, severing the final thread holding her together. Failing Arthur was an agony she could barely comprehend. Failing the intangible legacy of Magnus Dracar was a profound, deep shame that stained her very soul. But being rejected by Stella, the child she loved with every fiber of her being, the brilliant, stubborn little star who had unknowingly become the anchor of her world, the reason behind her relentless pursuit of strength, that was annihilation. Her grip slackened, strength fleeing her limbs. The Bacchen slipped from her numb fingers, clattering loudly, obscenely, onto the polished wooden floor. The training hall seemed to warp and darken around her, the sunlight turning cold and gray, the inspiring echoes of Magnus replaced by the crushing, suffocating weight of her own inadequacy, her own unforgivable, irredeemable failure. She had been given everything: life, love, purpose, legacy. And in the eyes of the two people who mattered most in the universe, she had proven utterly, hopelessly unworthy. The floor seemed to rush up to meet her as darkness claimed the edges of her vision. Darkness consumed Reika's collapsing consciousness. The final, devastating words, "You are not my mommy anymore," echoing in the void. But the psychic assault woven by Alisara did not grant oblivion. As Reika's awareness fragmented, the focus of the divine puppeteer shifted seamlessly, drawing another soul into its meticulously crafted torment. Rose opened her eyes, not to the cold stone of the Kagu courtyard, not to the concerned faces of her family, but to a place both achingly familiar and fundamentally wrong. She stood in a vast, impossibly perfect glass conservatory. Sunlight, filtered to a precise, sterile luminescence, streamed through the flawless panes, illuminating rows upon rows of roses. Blue roses, but not her blue roses, the ones that held the scent of quiet comfort and honest growth. These were unnaturally vibrant, their color too deep, their petals arranged with a geometric precision that felt cold, calculated. The air was warm, humid, yet carried no scent of damp earth or living blossoms, only a faint, cloying sweetness, like artificial perfume. It was a perfect garden, and it felt utterly dead. A figure moved among the unnerving blooms, tending to them with graceful, practiced hands that held silver pruning shears. Tall, elegant, radiating an aura of absolute, chilling control. Her mother. Rose's breath caught in her throat, a knot of old fear and suffocating duty tightening in her chest. Her mother was dead. Rose herself had been the one who had finally stopped her years ago. A desperate act of self-preservation against a suffocating, manipulative presence that sought to twist Rose's gift, her very essence, into a tool, a weapon. Yet here she stood, seemingly corporeal, radiating that same unnerving aura of command. "Rose, darling," the projection of her mother said, her voice a melody laced with ice, not turning around, punctual as always, though your energy feels cluttered. Still clinging to those sentimental attachments, I see. You are not real," Rose whispered, her hands trembling slightly. Her peak radiant power felt sluggish here, muted, as if the sterile atmosphere itself dampened her connection to true life. Her mother finally turned, a serene, knowing smile on her face. It was the smile Rose remembered from childhood, the one that always preceded a cutting remark disguised as loving guidance. "Real? What is real, child? Is the memory of my disappointment not real? Is the necessity of control not real?" She gestured with the shears towards a rose whose petals deviated slightly from perfection. With a single, precise snip, she removed the offending petal. "See? Order must be maintained. Sentimentality, empathy, these are weeds in the garden of power. They choke potential. True strength lies in utilizing life force efficiently, directing it, shaping it to one's will, not coddling it." The words echoed countless lectures from her past, the core of her mother's twisted philosophy. Alisara's fantasy was not just showing her a ghost. It was forcing her to relive the ideological prison she had fought so hard to escape. "That is not strength," Rose countered, forcing her voice to remain steady. "That is violation. Life is meant to grow, to connect, not to be controlled." Her mother laughed softly, a sound devoid of warmth. "Still so naive. You had the potential, Rose, the raw power, but you squandered it on nurturing, on feelings." She took a step closer, her eyes sharp, analytical. "Though perhaps killing me taught you something after all. A necessary pruning. You finally showed a spark of ruthlessness, a willingness to cut away what holds you back. Perhaps there is hope for you yet." The deliberate twisting of her most traumatic memory, framing the act of desperate self-defense as an embrace of her mother's cruelty, struck Rose with nauseating force. Bile rose in her throat. Before Rose could retort, another figure appeared beside her mother, materializing from the sterile sunlight. Arthur. But not her Arthur. This projection wore his face, his form, but his eyes were cold, assessing, mirroring the calculating gaze of her mother. He looked Rose up and down, his expression one of faint disappointment. "She is right, Rose?" this false Arthur said, his voice lacking its usual warmth and resonant kindness. "Your sentimentality is a liability. In the battles to come, against foes like Alisara, against the darkness gathering, we cannot afford weakness. We cannot afford hesitation born from misplaced empathy." He gestured around the sterile conservatory. "Your mother, for all her flaws, understood the necessity of control, the efficient application of power. You possess a unique gift, a connection to life itself. Stop treating it like a bomb and start wielding it like the weapon it is meant to be." Sight. User prompt. His gaze hardened. "We need soldiers, Rose, not gardeners. Shed this weakness. Embrace your mother's pragmatism. Become the potent force you were always capable of being. Stop clinging to these useless attachments and become the weapon we need you to be." The words, coming from him, shattered Rose's defenses in a way her mother's never could. Her deepest fear, not just of her mother's influence, but of losing herself in Arthur's shadow, of her gentle nature being seen as inadequate in his world of gods and monsters, was laid bare. He saw her love, her nurturing spirit, not as a strength, but as a flaw to be corrected, a weakness hindering the war effort. Tears welled in her eyes. The urge to please him, to be what he needed, warred violently with the core of her being. She felt her own life force stir within her, usually a warm, flowing river, now feeling constricted, pressured, tempted to sharpen itself into the cutting blades her mother had always envisioned, the weapon Arthur now seemed to demand. She could feel how to do it, how to twist vitality into a tool of control, of dominance. The knowledge felt inherent, a dark echo of her lineage. Her mother smiled, sensing the internal conflict. "Yes, child. Let go. Become strong. Make him proud. Make me proud." The false Arthur nodded in agreement, his cold eyes expectant. Rose looked at the sterile, perfect blue roses surrounding her. She looked at the projection of her mother radiating cold control. She looked at the projection of Arthur, demanding she sacrifice her essence to become a tool. And something within her, something deeper than fear, deeper than the desire to please, finally rebelled. "No." The single quote was a whisper of defiance in her soul. "This isn't strength. This isn't Arthur. This isn't life." She closed her eyes, shutting out the suffocating perfection of the conservatory, the demanding gazes. She reached inward, past the fear, past the imposed narrative, searching for the feeling she knew to be true. She remembered the warmth of Stella's hand in hers, the chaotic, vibrant energy of a Real forest, the feeling of sunlight on healthy soil, the quiet strength in Arthur's genuine smile when he looked at her, not a weapon. She focused on the simple, undeniable truth of growth, of connection, of life affirming itself, messy and imperfect and beautiful. Her own peak radiant power, usually flowing outwards, turned inwards, suffusing her being with that core truth. It wasn't an attack against the illusion. It was an assertion of her fundamental nature. She opened her eyes. The conservatory was still there, her mother and the false Arthur still watching. But at her feet, pushing defiantly through a hairline crack in the flawless, sterile floor, a single, tiny, ordinary green weed was unfurling its leaves towards the artificial light. It was small, insignificant, yet vibrantly, stubbornly alive. Real. Rose stared at it, a tiny anchor in the suffocating sea of Alisara's fantasy. The illusion hadn't shattered. The oppressive weight of the divine presence still pressed down. But a seed of resistance had been planted. Her own truth, small and vulnerable, was pushing back against the sterile perfection of the lie. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since being trapped, Rose felt the stirrings not of despair, but of hope. Rachel's awareness snapped into focus not with a gasp, but with a jolt of pure, ice-cold terror that constricted her chest, instantly familiar and utterly nauseating. She was small again, no older than 8, her limbs feeling clumsy, her perspective low to the ground. She stood just outside a heavy, ornate door in the Creighton estate, specifically, the wing her mother had occupied during that terrible period. Sunlight streamed through a high window nearby, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, catching the gold in her own childhood hair, glinting off the polished, sterile perfection of the corridor floor. The air was unnaturally still, carrying the faint, cloying scent of stale perfume and something else. Ozone? Fear? Her small hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, an echo of a past self acting out a scene she had relived 1,000 times in her darkest dreams. The door creaked open slightly, just as it had then, revealing a sliver of the room beyond. And there she was, her mother, Isolde. But this wasn't the Isolde who had knelt before her years ago, broken and remorseful. This was the Isolde etched into her deepest trauma, the seer consumed by visions, radiating a cold, judgmental distance that felt like a physical weight. She sat in a high-backed armchair, bathed in the same sterile sunlight, looking impossibly beautiful and terrifyingly remote. "Mommy!" The word escaped Rachel's lips, small, hesitant, the voice of a child desperate for reassurance. The projected Isolde turned her head slowly. Her eyes, usually a sharp, intelligent blue, seemed distant, unfocused, yet held a chilling certainty. A faint, almost imperceptible glow flickered within them. A smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was a mask, stretched thin over unimaginable horrors. "Rachel, darling," the projection said. Her voice the melodic chime Rachel remembered from before everything changed. "Come here." Hesitantly, propelled by the phantom hope of that long-ago child, Rachel pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The room was exactly as she remembered it, suffocatingly perfect, every object precisely placed, devoid of any warmth or personal touch. "You disappoint me, Rachel," the projected Isolde stated, her voice losing its melodic quality, sharpening into the cutting precision that had flayed Rachel's spirit raw during that week of hell. "Your progress is adequate, merely adequate. Your grasp of fundamental principles remains pedestrian. You lack the necessary vision, the ruthlessness, to truly wield the power inherent in our bloodline." Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking the old wounds of inadequacy, the deeply ingrained fear of never being enough. Rachel felt herself shrinking under that cold, assessing gaze, the confident peak radiant momentarily lost within the terrified 8-year-old. Then, the scene shifted, warped sickeningly, the opulent sitting room dissolving like smoke. Rachel found herself standing in a warm, softly lit nursery, filled with gentle colors and the scent of baby powder. Felt real, comforting. A small, intricately carved crib stood in the center of the room. Hesitantly, drawn by an unseen force, Rachel approached it. Inside, a baby girl slept peacefully, wrapped in soft blankets. Her tiny face was a heart-wrenching, impossibly perfect blend of Rachel's own features and Arthur's. A tuft of dark black hair, just like his, peeked out from under the blanket. As Rachel watched, mesmerized, the baby stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Deep blue eyes, Rachel's own shade, stared up at her, and within them, impossibly, unmistakably, tiny flecks of brilliant gold shimmered. "Our daughter." The single quote hit Rachel with the force of a physical blow, a wave of fierce, overwhelming love surging through her, so potent it almost shattered the illusion right then and there. The baby gurgled, reaching a tiny hand towards her. "Mommy?" The single word echoed in the quiet room, impossibly sweet. Rachel's heart ached. She reached down, wanting nothing more than to scoop the child into her arms, to protect this impossible, precious life. But as her hand drew near, she heard a voice. Her own voice, cold, sharp, echoing with Isolde's cruel cadence. "You disappoint me, Her own voice said, seeming to emanate from her against her will. Your potential is wasted. You lack focus. Merely adequate. She watched in numb horror as her own hand, moving with a will separate from her own, reached out not to caress, but to adjust the baby's blanket with a gesture devoid of any warmth, any tenderness. Her own face, reflected dimly in the polished wood of the crib rail, settled into the same lines of cold, critical judgment she remembered seeing on her mother's face. The baby, sensing the chill, the lack of love, began to whimper, those beautiful blue-gold eyes filling with tears. This was it. Her deepest, most paralyzing terror laid bare. Not just the reliving of her own trauma, the memory of Isolde's abuse, but the horrifying certainty that the damage was inherent, the cycle unbreakable. The fear that the coldness, the fear, the madness she had absorbed from her mother was now a permanent part of her, a poison she would inevitably inflict upon her own child, becoming the very monster she had spent her life vowing never to be. Nausea twisted in her gut. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She wanted to scream, to recoil, to deny the horrifying reflection. But the illusion held her fast, forcing her to confront this unbearable potential future, this seemingly inevitable damnation. No, please, not this, her mind shrieked. I won't become her. I won't. But even as the emotional storm threatened to tear her apart, a core part of Rachel's being, the relentless analyst, the scientist who had built her life on logic and evidence, remained stubbornly detached, observing, dissecting. It noted the perfection of the nightmare, the precise echo of Isolde's specific verbal barbs, the almost too convenient mirroring of her most secret fear. Felt, engineered. The cyclical nature of the abuse narrative, presented so starkly, so predictably, it lacked the messy, illogical, contradictory nuances of real trauma, real human failing. It felt like a carefully constructed hypothesis, a projection designed by an external intelligence, Alisara, specifically to elicit this precise, paralyzing emotional response. This is a construct, the single quote surfaced again, stronger this time, a lifeline of pure, cold logic in the emotional tempest. Flawed, predictable, based on fear amplified by divine power, but ultimately, not real, not my future. She couldn't simply shatter the illusion through sheer force of will. The divine power underpinning it, Alisara's complete control, was too strong, too pervasive. But she could dissect it. She latched onto the inconsistencies, the predictability of the narrative loop, the subtle wrongness in the projected Arthur, the overly simplistic echo of Isolde. She began analyzing the structure of the nightmare itself, treating it not as a horrifying reality to be endured, but as a flawed dataset, a poorly designed psychological experiment to be deconstructed. She started searching for the core axiom, the faulty premise, the single illogical leap upon which Alisara had built this personalized hell. The fear was still undeniably real, a chilling echo of past pain resonating within her. The image of her potential daughter's tear-filled eyes would likely haunt her. But now, that fear was accompanied by the cold, sharp, and ultimately empowering focus of a scientist who had just found a critical flaw in the enemy's design. The cage might hold for now, but Rachel had found the blueprint. She began looking for the key. Serafina opened her eyes, though the term felt profoundly inadequate for the sensory input she received. There was no light, no darkness, only an infinite, featureless expanse of absolute, soul-deep cold. She wasn't standing on ice, nor floating in void. She felt suspended within the cold itself, yet utterly disconnected from it, like a mote of dust frozen perfectly in the center of an endless crystal. This wasn't the dynamic, challenging, almost alive cold of the true Frostheart cavern she had endured for a grueling year, a place defined by immense, shifting pressures, subtle resonant energies, and the constant, demanding potential for profound growth. This was horrifyingly different. It was the cold of perfect stasis, of absolute zero achieved and held eternally, devoid of any energy fluctuation, any potential, any hint of temporal progression. It was the sterile, unchanging cold of a conceptual tomb, meticulously designed not merely to isolate her physically and mentally, but to extinguish the very possibility of warmth, connection, transformation, or becoming. The silence was absolute, a pressure against her eardrums, against her very soul, more profound and deafening than any sound could ever be. This place is false, she thought, the single quote immediate, automatic, not a conclusion reached through panic or fear, but of cold, objective analysis honed by months spent in the true crucible of universal winter. The real void, the true heart of absolute cold she had touched in the cavern, hummed with latent potential, throbbed with the silent echoes of creation balancing entropy. This place was utterly silent, unnaturally empty, a poorly constructed imitation lacking fundamental substance, a stage set for a cruder form of torment. Then, the echoes arrived, inserted directly into her consciousness with surgical, calculated precision. Not as sounds, not even as distinct visions, but as chilling psychic impressions designed to bypass her formidable mental defenses by resonating with established pathways of grief and carefully controlled fear. First, a fragmented, distorted sensory input overlaid her perception. The visual of an impossibly cold, gray day on Mount Hua. The indistinct murmur of ritualistic weeping nearly lost in the howling wind. The sharp, cloying scent of specific funereal incense used only for high masters. A fleeting glimpse of a closed casket draped in the stark white and silver colors of the Zenith lineage. It was an echo warped and hollowed out of her mother's funeral rites years ago, an event Serafina had processed with rigorous, icy control. The projected memory felt simultaneously sharp in its details and emotionally flat, designed to trigger the old, carefully contained sorrow through familiar sensory input. Serafina observed the sensation dispassionately. She acknowledged the memory fragments, the flicker of remembered, long-mastered pain. But the projection lacked the true, complex, resonant weight of the actual event, the subtle undercurrents of political maneuvering mixed with genuine grief that had defined that period. Felt synthetic, incomplete. Before she could fully dissect the flawed construction of the first echo, the second crashed upon her consciousness, far more potent, far more immediate, targeted with malicious, pinpoint accuracy at her deepest vulnerability. Arthur's life force, or rather a projection designed to mimic it. Not the steady, powerful, complex signature she knew intimately, the quiet, persistent hum of gray and harmony and soul resonance that had, against all her inclinations, become a constant, grounding presence in her world. This was a projection mimicking that signature, but flickering erratically, desperately, like a candle flame caught in an impossible gale, seeming to emanate from an infinite distance, across dimensions, across lifetimes impossibly far away. Then, abruptly, sickeningly, it extinguished, snuffed out, gone. The projected emptiness where his vibrant, complex presence should have resonated was absolute, a void that screamed louder than any sound in the sterile silence of her prison. Her breath hitched in her throat, a purely involuntary physical reaction to the psychic blow. This echo felt sharper, more viscerally real than the first, designed to exploit her deepest, most rigorously suppressed fear. The image flooded her mind, unbidden yet perfectly crafted by Alisara's power. Arthur falling, overwhelmed by some unseen, overwhelming foe, utterly alone in some distant, desolate place, his strength finally failing, perhaps calling her name inaudibly across the void while she remained trapped here, useless, frozen, impotent in this sterile, meaningless prison. The core fear she had buried beneath literal and metaphorical glaciers of self-control, the utter, abject helplessness of isolation, the terror not of the cold itself, but of being unable to reach, unable to protect, the very few fragile connections she allowed herself to value, the horror of possessing immense, world-altering power yet being rendered utterly irrelevant, utterly powerless, when it truly mattered surged upwards with terrifying force, threatening to shatter the icy calm she had cultivated over decades. Grief, sharp and cold as the illusory prison surrounding her, lanced through her core, felt overwhelmingly real. The projected emptiness felt absolute, final. But even as the wave of calculated despair washed over her, seeking to drown her in helplessness, the profound internal stillness she had achieved and perfected in the true Frostheart cavern held firm. It was an anchor point deeper than emotion, deeper than fear, a place of absolute zero within her own soul that mirrored, yet fundamentally differed from, the sterile void Alisara had crafted. She observed the grief dispassionately. She analyzed the sensation of loss with chilling precision. The feeling was immense, expertly crafted, overwhelming in its intensity. But the source, the projected absence of Arthur, it lacked his unique, complex signature. It was a perfect void, yes, convincingly empty. But Arthur's presence was not merely the absence of void. It was a specific, intricate, resonant something. A complex chord of energies and concepts she knew as well as her own reflection. This projection was the cessation of a generic, albeit powerful, life force given his label. It was not the true, specific, resonant silence that the loss of him, the unique entity Arthur Nightingale, would create in the universe, in her. It was another masterful forgery, emotionally devastating but conceptually flawed. A lie, she concluded, the single quote a point of absolute certainty, a shard of pure, cold, undeniable truth crystallizing in the illusory void. Sophisticated, painful, but fundamentally, demonstrably untrue. She could not yet break free from the icy prison by force. The conceptual weight of Alisara's divine will was too pervasive, the very fabric of this non-place meticulously designed to suppress her specific form of power. But she could refuse to believe the central falsehood upon which this specific, targeted torment was constructed. She anchored herself resolutely in the clear, precise memory of Arthur's true presence. The complex, vibrant, often infuriating energy signature she knew with absolute certainty still existed. She focused relentlessly on the discrepancy, the subtle but undeniable conceptual wrongness of the projected emptiness Alisara presented as his demise. Cecilia found herself standing in the vast, echoing expanse of the imperial throne room in Avalon. But it was horrifyingly wrong. The familiar grandeur was gone, replaced by decay and neglect. Dust lay thick on the polished obsidian floor, motes dancing visibly in weak, watery beams of light filtering through grime-streaked, towering windows. Priceless tapestries depicting the empire's history hung frayed and faded, some torn, revealing bare stone beneath. The twin imperial thrones, usually gleaming symbols of power and continuity, were dull, chipped, shrouded in cobwebs. The air itself felt heavy, stagnant, thick with the cloying scent of dust, decay, and utter, profound failure. Arthur stood before the empty thrones, his back to her. He didn't wear his usual practical attire, nor the formal wear of state functions. He was clad in simple, dark clothing, his posture conveying not strength, but a weary, final resignation. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence directly. He simply spoke, his voice quiet, yet carrying a weight of absolute finality that crushed the breath from her lungs, echoing unervingly in the decaying hall. "It is done, Cecilia," he said, the words falling like stones into the oppressive silence. And then he began to speak of her past. Not her achievements, not her struggles, not the heavy burden of leadership she had carried since birth. He spoke of her youth, of the arrogance, the entitlement, the casual cruelty she had sometimes wielded as a princess shielded from consequence. He spoke of specific incidents, long buried under layers of duty and genuine change, incidents where she had treated attendants like objects, rivals like pawns, people's feelings like inconvenient variables in her personal equations. "You treated people like toys," the projection of Arthur stated, his voice flat, devoid of heat, yet utterly damning. "Playthings to be manipulated for your amusement or discarded when they ceased to be useful. You saw lineage as a shield, power as a license, empathy as a weakness to be exploited in others." He recounted a specific, humiliating memory, a social slight delivered with calculated precision, a rival dismissed with casual contempt, an attendant punished for an imagined infraction, details dredged up from the recesses of her mind, amplified, twisted, presented as the undeniable sum of her character. "I understand on some level," he continued, still not turning, his voice taking on a tone of weary judgment. The pressures of your station, the isolation, the expectations. But understanding does not excuse. That willingness to view others as less, as tools for your ambition or entertainment, it remains, hidden perhaps, polished by duty, but present. He finally turned, and the sight of his face nearly broke her carefully constructed composure. There was no anger, no hatred, no fury, only a profound, sorrowful distance, a quiet, settled certainty that felt more devastating than any rage. His eyes, usually filled with warmth, respect, or fierce determination when he looked at her, now held only a calm, final judgment. I cannot build the future I envision, the just future we fight for, with that shadow, that potential for casual cruelty, standing beside me on the throne, he said. The empire deserves a ruler whose heart is not compromised by such inherent flaws. I deserve a partner whose foundations are built on respect, not just control. His gaze met hers, clear, unwavering, absolute in its rejection. You are, at your core, compromised by who you once were, unworthy of the burden you carry, unworthy of the trust required. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a final, quiet dismissal. I release you from your duties to the empire that you are unfit to lead, from our bond which was built on a flawed perception. His voice dropped, delivering the final blow. Go. Leave Avalon. Find some quiet corner of the world and reflect on the person you failed to become. Abandonment, judgment based on a self she had fought for years to overcome. Rejection, absolute and final, from the one person whose belief in her, whose partnership, had become the bedrock of her existence, the motivation for her own transformation. The throne room seemed to tilt, the decaying grandeur mocking her. The weight of his judgment felt absolute, crushing not just her authority, but her very sense of self, invalidating the years of genuine change, the love she felt, the person she had painstakingly become for him, with him. Tears, hot and humiliating, threatened to breach the iron control she maintained over her emotions. A strangled sound escaped her lips. She wanted to scream, to rage, to argue, to force him to see the woman she was now, not the entitled girl she had been. But the cold finality in his projected gaze, the utter certainty of his judgment, seemed unshakable, absolute. It played perfectly on her deepest, most hidden vulnerability, the fear that her past mistakes were unforgivable, that the core of her was inherently flawed, making her ultimately unworthy of the love and trust she craved, especially from Arthur, whose moral compass, whose fundamental goodness, she respected above all else. Yet, even as despair threatened to shatter her imperial facade, the core of her being, the indomitable will forged in the crucible of royal politics, the strength that had seen her navigate plots and betrayals and the weight of an empire, refused to break completely. This Arthur, the coldness, the simplistic judgment, the utter lack of nuance, felt wrong, too flat, too absolute. The real Arthur, the man she knew, the man she loved with a fierceness that surprised even herself, was complex. He understood the gray areas, the burden of necessary evils, even when he despised them. He judged actions, yes, but he also saw potential, acknowledged change, offered not just condemnation, but the possibility of redemption, of growth. This cold, final dismissal, focusing solely on her past sins while ignoring years of genuine transformation, it lacked his depth, his fundamental fairness, his belief in her. This is not him. The single quote was a spark of furious defiance igniting in the encroaching darkness. This is a phantom, a projection of my own deepest fear, given his voice by her power. It focuses only on what I was, because it cannot comprehend who I am now. Within the decaying grandeur of the illusory throne room, Cecilia stood defiant. The phantom Arthur before her continued his cold dismissal, his words crafted to exploit her deepest insecurities about her past and her worthiness. But the core of the crown princess, forged in political fire and tempered by genuine love and responsibility, refused to break. She saw the illusion for what it was, a caricature, a weaponized fear. You are not him, the single quote echoed in her mind, a shield of certainty. And you do not define me. Her peak radiant aura, previously suppressed by the conceptual weight of the nightmare, began to flare, not aggressively, but assertively, pushing back against the oppressive decay, asserting her right to exist, to rule, to love and be loved despite her flaws. The projection of Arthur flickered, its cold certainty wavering slightly under her unwavering gaze. Simultaneously, in the sterile, icy void designed to extinguish her spirit, Seraphina continued her meticulous internal search. Anchored by the certainty that the projection of Arthur's death was a lie, she used the absolute stillness imposed by the prison as a lens. She focused her senses inward, then outward, feeling for the subtle dissonances, the imperfections in Alisara's construct. The cold here was too perfect, too uniform. Real cold, even the absolute zero of the Frostheart cavern, possessed subtle gradients, quantum fluctuations. This was static, dead. And within that deadness, she found it a single point where the conceptual ice felt infinitesimally thinner, where the assertion of absolute zero wavered. It was the anchor point, the linchpin of the illusion. With calm, focused intent, she directed her own mastery of cold, not as an attack, but as a precise resonant frequency, towards that single point. A hairline crack appeared in the infinite ice, then another, spreading outwards silently. In the suffocatingly perfect garden, Rose knelt before the tiny, defiant weed, drawing strength from its simple, honest life. The projections of her mother and the false Arthur continued their insidious whispers, urging her to become a weapon, to prune away her empathy. But Rose focused on the weed, pouring her own life energy into it, not forcing it, but nurturing its inherent will to grow. As she did, the weed strengthened, its green becoming impossibly vibrant against the sterile backdrop. And then, other points of green began to appear, tiny shoots pushing through other cracks in the flawless floor, drawn by the resonance of authentic life she projected. The sterile garden was being invaded by reality. The projections recoiled slightly, their forms flickering as the foundation of their illusory world began to erode. Within the horrifying nursery, Rachel's mind worked with cold, desperate precision. She ignored the whimpering of the illusory child, ignored the chilling echo of her own voice twisted into a soul's cruelty. She focused solely on the structure of the nightmare, the cyclical repetition, the perfect mirroring of her deepest fear. It was too perfect, too logical in its cruelty. Trauma wasn't this neat. Fear wasn't this predictable. It's a feedback loop, she realized, the single quote a flash of insight, designed to reinforce itself. But loops have entry points and exit conditions. She began tracing the conceptual architecture of the illusion, searching for the flawed premise, the illogical command that initiated the cycle. Her analytical mind, her greatest weapon, became a scalpel dissecting the very fabric of the fantasy. She found it a contradiction in the emotional programming, a paradox in the imposed narrative of inescapable repetition. At the same instant, across the conceptual divide, Luna, adrift in the timeless, fateless void where Arthur had supposedly abandoned her and died, found her own anchor. The shattering of their bond had felt absolute, devastating. But her Chilan nature, her connection to the deeper currents of existence, sensed an anomaly. Even in severance, a true bond leaves an echo, a scar in causality. This projected emptiness was too clean. It was the absence of a generic connection, not the specific jagged wound the loss of Arthur would create. Wrong, she thought, latching onto that subtle but fundamental untruth. The resonance is wrong. Focusing on the memory of their true bond's unique signature, she began to pull, gently but inexorably, against the false void, seeking the faint residual echo of what was real. Reka, kneeling in the training hall, consumed by the projected judgment of Arthur and the devastating rejection of Stella, found her anchor in the very legacy she felt she had failed. Magnus' art wasn't just about technique. It was about truth, about the undeniable finality of a perfect cut. This despair, this feeling of absolute worthlessness, it felt imprecise, muddled. It lacked the clean, sharp finality of true failure. Even failure has structure, she thought, her discipline reasserting itself. This feeling is chaos. Incorrect. She focused on the memory of Arthur's actual trust, on Stella's genuine affection. She compared it to the hollow cruelty of the projections. The dissonance was jarring. She reached not for the fallen Bakken, but for the core principle of Magnus' teaching. Find the truth. Cut away the rest. Her spirit, honed by years of discipline, began to reject the overwhelming weight of the imposed inadequacy. Their individual points of resistance, born from their core strengths and deepest truths, resonated. Perhaps facilitated by the synchronization forged during their 2 years of shared training. A subtle connection sparked between their trapped minds. They weren't suddenly in the same space, but they became aware of each other, a flicker of Cecilia's iron will bolstering Rachel's logic, a wave of Rose's life-affirming energy reaching Serafina in the cold, a pulse of Luna's fate sense clarifying Reika's perception. Empowered by this shared awareness, they pushed back simultaneously. Cecilia didn't just stand defiant. She imposed her own will onto the decaying throne room, declaring its judgment invalid. Rachel didn't just find the exit loop. She forced it open with relentless logic. Serafina didn't just crack the ice. She shattered the anchor point with a focused pulse of absolute zero directed by pure intent. Rose didn't just nurture life. She unleashed it, turning the sterile garden into an explosion of uncontrollable, authentic growth that overwhelmed the illusion. Reika didn't just reject failure. She embodied Magnus' truth, conceptually cutting the illusory bonds of despair. Luna didn't just find the echo. She pulled on the true thread of her bond with Arthur, anchoring herself back to reality. The 6 personalized nightmares shattered simultaneously. The world around them dissolved, not into the Kagu courtyard, but into a different space, vast, opulent, unsettlingly perfect, draped in crimson silks that seemed to absorb the light. It felt like the throne room Alisara had momentarily projected onto Arthur, the heart of her fantasy domain. And there, seated on a throne of woven crimson threads, was her projection, identical to the one that had appeared from the letter. She regarded the 6 women, now standing together, weary but resolute, in the center of her conceptual space. She didn't look angry. She looked amused. Slowly, deliberately, she began to clap, the sound echoing unnaturally in the vast, silent chamber. "Bravo!" Alisara's voice purred, dripping with condescending sarcasm. "Truly bravo. You actually managed to unravel my little welcoming gift. Stronger wills than I anticipated. Or perhaps merely more predictable in your attachments." Her eyes swept over them, cold and dismissive. Impressive, for mortals playing dress-up in peak radiant power. She rose gracefully from the throne, the movement fluid, effortless. But do not mistake breaking a tailored illusion for genuine strength. That was merely a taste, a demonstration of the kind of power you face. An appetizer. She smiled, a flash of predatory perfection. The main course? You couldn't even comprehend it, let alone withstand it. Her form flickered slightly, radiating a pressure that made even their combined peak radiant auras seem fragile. "Consider my warning reiterated," she said, her voice losing its amusement, hardening into cold command. "Stay out of what comes next between myself and Arthur. He walks a path you cannot follow. Your presence would only hinder him, endanger him, bore me." Her gaze lingered on them, sharp and final. "Attempt to interfere again. Attempt to play the valiant protectors with your inadequate power, and I will not simply trap your minds. I will extinguish them. Permanently." Luna stepped forward slightly, her golden eyes blazing. "You won't have him." Alisara laughed, a genuinely amused, chilling sound. "Darling Cheelin, I already do. He just doesn't realize it yet." "We will stop you," Cecilia stated, her voice ringing with imperial authority, though her hands were clenched tightly at her sides. "We will kill you," Reika added, her voice a low, dangerous promise. Rose, Rachel, and Serafina stood beside them, their expressions masks of grim determination, echoing the vow silently. Internally, however, A cold wave of despair washed over them. They projected defiance, but the encounter, both the personalized nightmares and this final confrontation, had driven home the terrifying truth. Alisara wasn't just stronger. She operated on a different plane of existence. Her casual demonstration had effortlessly overwhelmed all 6 of them simultaneously, while she wasn't even physically present. They were too weak. The abyss between peak radiant and her divine state felt absolute, uncrossable. Their vows felt like brave, hollow whispers against a hurricane, but they held onto that defiance, that fragile hope, because it was all they had left. Alisara merely smiled at their threats, a final, pitying glance. "Adorable," she whispered. Then, with a dismissive wave of her hand, the crimson throne room dissolved. Their awareness snapped back violently. Gasping, disoriented, they found themselves lying on the cold stone of the Kagu courtyard. Arthur, Lucifer, Ran, Alice, and Tiamat were kneeling beside them, faces etched with worry. The psychic residue of the fantasy world clung to them, cold and nauseating. They pushed themselves up, trembling, sharing horrified, understanding glances. The despair was real. The power gap was real. Their path forward was terrifyingly clear. The silence in the Kagu courtyard was thick, heavy with the psychic residue of divine violation and the chilling reality of their collective helplessness. One by one, the 6 women pushed themselves shakily upright. The vibrant energy of their peak radiant auras dimmed, overshadowed by a shared, bone-deep exhaustion and the haunted look of those who had just been intimately acquainted with their deepest fears. They gathered instinctively, drawing fragile strength from proximity, the hard-won synchronization of their training now a silent pact of mutual support against the lingering shock. Rachel was pale, her analytical composure visibly fractured, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly as she ran diagnostic scans over herself and the others, her mind struggling to quantify the purely conceptual nature of the assault they had endured. Seraphina stood rigid, her glacial calm absolute as ever, but her ice-blue eyes held a new, chilling depth, reflecting the absolute zero of the prison she had clawed her way out of. Cecilia's regal bearing remained, a testament to her iron will, but the subtle tremor in her clenched fists betrayed the immense effort it cost her. The phantom judgment still echoed, a wound beneath the imperial armor. Rose looked small, profoundly vulnerable, her usually nurturing aura flickering uncertainly as she fought back tears, the memory of her mother's twisted projection a fresh, raw violation. Reika's discipline held her upright, ramrod straight, but her gaze was distant, fixed on some internal point of failure the nightmare had relentlessly exposed. Luna's golden eyes, typically serene pools reflecting infinite possibilities, were shadowed, clouded by the forced severance and the chilling echo of Arthur's projected death. Lucifer and Run stood nearby, their own peak radiant power offering a silent, protective presence, their expressions grim, reflecting the utter helplessness they had felt while witnessing the attack unfold, unable to intervene. Alice and Tiamat's projection observed the scene, their ancient eyes filled with a heavy understanding of the true stakes, the terrifying, almost insurmountable reality of the power they now faced. Arthur moved towards his fiancées, relief warring with a cold, strategic clarity within him. The demonstration had been far more brutal, far more invasive than he could have anticipated. Alisara hadn't just shown her power. She had used their deepest vulnerabilities as weapons with surgical precision. But the terrible necessity had been served. They now understood. "Are you all right?" The question felt utterly inadequate, almost insulting given what they had just endured. But it was the only place to start. Cecilia was the first to regain her voice, straightening her shoulders with visible effort, the crown princess reasserting control over herself, if not the situation. "We are intact," she stated, her voice tight but unwavering. The experience was illuminating. Illuminating, Rachel echoed, a hysterical edge creeping into her tone as she finally looked up from her scanner, her eyes flashing with a mixture of terror and fury. "She pulled us into personalized psychic torture chambers, Cecilia, simultaneously, while projecting her consciousness from miles away. She wasn't even physically here. That wasn't illuminating. It was... She trailed off, unable to find a word sufficient for the sheer scale of the violation, the utter powerlessness they had felt. It was a demonstration, Serafina finished quietly, her voice like fractured ice, devoid of inflection. A demonstration of the chasm between our current level and hers. A demonstration of our inadequacy. The word hung in the air, cold, sharp, and undeniably true. She played with us, Reika added, her voice low, flat, her gaze still distant, locked onto the memory of failure. Like insignificant toys. Rose finally looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears, but also burning with a fierce, protective light as she looked directly at Arthur. Arthur, you cannot face her alone. We felt what she can do. Even if we stand together, the six of us. She's right, Luna interrupted, her voice regaining some of its usual resonant calm, though shadowed with the memory of her traumatic vision. Her control is absolute, conceptual. She targeted our core identities, our deepest fears. Alone, she could shatter your will before you even raise your hand. No, Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable firmness that cut through their rising fear and protective instincts. He stepped closer, meeting each of their gazes in turn, letting them feel the steady, unwavering certainty radiating from him. You felt her power. You understand the nature of it now. That is exactly why I must face her alone, at least initially. That is madness, Lucifer interjected sharply, stepping forward, his protective instincts flaring. We just saw what she did. Our combined peak radiant power barely registered. Against her direct conceptual force, raw power is insufficient, Arthur conceded calmly. But her greatest strength, that complete control, relies on imposing her narrative, her will onto others. She controls minds, emotions, perceptions, adding more minds, more emotions, more vulnerabilities to the battlefield. He shook his head decisively. You experienced how she targeted your specific fears, your past traumas. Imagine her doing that mid-combat, turning Rachel's logic into paradoxes, using Cecilia's authority to sow dissent, twisting Rose's empathy into weakness, exploiting Serafina's stillness, Reika's discipline, Luna's foresight. She would not just fight me. She would use you as psychic weapons against me. We would tear each other apart before we even reached her inner sanctum. The six women exchanged uneasy, horrified glances, the chilling logic of his words sinking in. They had just experienced firsthand, in the most intimate and violating way possible, Alisara's terrifying ability to manipulate their deepest selves. The thought of that power turned outwards, used strategically in the chaos of battle. My path forward is different, Arthur continued, his voice steady, his gaze holding theirs. It must be. My gray power negates, asserts objective truth against her imposed fantasy. My harmony seeks fundamental balance. My soul resonance connects, understands, potentially offering a way to disrupt her mental control at its source. These are not tools designed to overpower her brute force directly, but perhaps, just perhaps, they hold the unique conceptual key to unraveling her specific form of control. It is a path only I can walk, a key only I might possess. Your presence, your strength in that initial confrontation would tragically become the vulnerability she will exploit to ensure my failure. He softened his tone then, letting the deep, unwavering love and trust he felt for each of them flow outwards, a silent assurance carried on soul resonance. This is not about pride. It is not about me believing I am stronger alone. I am not. It is about cold, hard strategy. It is about countering her specific, insidious weapon with the only potential counters we possess. Your role, your true strength in this phase is absolutely vital, absolutely critical, but it lies elsewhere. While I focus inward, preparing to find that conceptual key, you must fight the war she enables. Dismantle her cult. Rescue the prisoners she uses, including Lyra's brother. Bleed her resources dry. Contain her influence with your combined peak radiant might. Keep the world safe while I prepare to face her core power. That is our only path to victory. Tears streamed unchecked down Rachel's face, but she nodded slowly, her brilliant analytical mind accepting the brutal, unavoidable strategic necessity. Serafina closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them, clear and filled with icy resolve. Cecilia lifted her chin, the crown princess accepting the heavy strategic imperative despite the immense personal risk to him. Rose wiped her eyes fiercely, her expression firming with a quiet, powerful determination. Reka met his gaze directly, her own focus sharpening, accepting her duty without reservation. Luna gave a single, slow, sorrowful nod, her connection to fate perhaps showing her the difficult, dangerous truth of his chosen path. They understood. The despair born from their terrifying helplessness was being transmuted, reforged into a different, grimmer kind of resolve, the determination to fight the shadow war they could win, to hold the line with everything they had, to buy him the precious, vital time he needed to undertake the impossible internal journey. Later, much later, after the immediate plans for the global containment strategy were underway, after Lucifer and Ren had departed via Grey seemed to coordinate directly with Kagu and Imperial forces scattered across the east, after his fiancés had retreated to their own quarters to process, recuperate, and begin their focused preparations for the Shadow War, Alice found Arthur alone on one of the estate's high, wind-swept balconies overlooking the sleeping mountain valley. The sun had long set, leaving behind a sky dusted with cold, distant stars. The air was crisp, clean. He stared out at the dark, silent peaks, his mind already turning inward, contemplating the daunting, uncharted path ahead. "You could have intervened," Alice stated quietly from behind him. Her voice wasn't accusatory, but held a note of sharp, dispassionate observation, questioning the calculation behind his deliberate inaction during Alisara's psychic assault. "When she trapped their minds, you felt it happening. You possess the means soul resonance, perhaps even a precise application of the Grey's negation, to disrupt such a construct, especially one projected from afar and divided among 6 targets." He didn't turn immediately, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "Yes," he finally admitted, his voice low, devoid of any defensiveness. "I could have. Likely. But you chose not to," Alice pressed, her tone remaining level, analytical. "You allowed them to endure that violation." He finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim starlight. "Yes," he repeated firmly. "I did. Because they needed to understand Alice. Not intellectually, not through Ren's testimony or Luna's analysis. They needed to feel it viscerally. They needed to comprehend, in their very cores, the absolute nature of her power, the sheer, unbridgeable difference between the peak we currently stand on and the divine abyss she occupies." He held her steady gaze. Words wouldn't have been enough. Logical arguments wouldn't have been enough. They needed that terror, that helplessness, to accept the strategic necessity of my facing her alone initially, to accept their role in containment without suicidal attempts at direct intervention. They wouldn't have let me go otherwise. He paused, the admission hanging heavy in the cold night air. "It was a calculated risk," he continued quietly, "a gamble on their strength, their resilience, a necessary cruelty, perhaps, to ensure our only viable path forward remained open. A choice made because I trust them to endure, and because the alternative is letting Alisara win because we were too afraid to make the hard decision." A flicker of something complex crossed Alice's face in the dim light, acknowledgement of the harsh, cold strategic logic, perhaps a flicker of maternal disapproval at the method, but ultimately a deep, weary understanding. She knew the grim, often brutal calculus of leadership when facing existential threats, the sometimes terrible choices required to protect the greater whole. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, accepting his reasoning, if not entirely condoning the emotional cost. "The path you have chosen now," she said, her voice returning to its usual quiet authority. "Forging your divinity internally, seeking a unique conceptual counter, it will be profoundly isolating. More dangerous, perhaps, than any physical battle. You will face not just the limits of power, but the very foundations of your own being." "I know," Arthur replied, But as you said, they need an orchestra. I need to become the conductor who understands the music she plays. They stood in silence for another moment, the unspoken weight of the future pressing down, heavier than any mountain. Then Arthur turned back towards the distant horizon, towards the unseen glow of Avalon far to the west. I need to go, he said. Before I begin this descent, there is one more anchor I need to secure. Alice understood immediately. Go, she said softly, a rare note of warmth entering her voice. Anchor yourself. Remember why you fight. Remember the light you protect. He nodded, a profound gratitude tightening his chest. He reached for the gray, the familiar, quiet power answering his call without hesitation. The cold mountain air dissolved around him. He had one stop to make before descending into the internal crucible, one promise to keep, one small, bright star to hold on to before facing the long, uncertain darkness ahead. Avalon and Stella awaited. The gray seemed closed behind me, collapsing the cold, tense atmosphere of the Kagu estate into a silent point of non-existence. In its place flooded the familiar, comforting quiet of my Avalon penthouse. Sunlight, warmer here than in the high mountain valley, streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the comfortable, lived-in space that had become the anchor point of my increasingly chaotic existence. The faint scent of ozone and solder hung in the air, overlaid with the lingering aroma of Reika's morning coffee. Home. The weight on my shoulders did not vanish, but it shifted, lessened by the simple, profound reality of being back in this space. The grim decisions made in the Kagu courtyard, the shadow war led by my family, my own solitary path towards confronting Alisara, felt momentarily distant, held at bay by the invisible wards of domesticity. My priority, for these few precious hours before the final act began, was singular. I walked towards the area Stella had long since annexed as her personal laboratory. The double doors slid open silently, revealing controlled chaos. What had once been a secondary living room was now unrecognizable, transformed into a high-tech workshop that would make most university R&D departments envious. Holographic schematics shimmered in the air, casting complex geometric patterns on walls lined with diagnostic equipment and fabrication tools. Components lay scattered across reinforced workbenches, microcapacitors, exotic alloys, intricate wiring harnesses. The low hum of active machinery provided a steady baseline to the room's energy. And in the center of it all, perched on a high stool, utterly absorbed, was Stella. 15. The 2 years had stretched her taller, leaner, the last vestiges of childhood softness giving way to the sharp, focused intensity that defined her. Her dark hair, longer now, was haphazardly tied back, escaping strands framing a face dominated by intelligent, perceptive eyes that missed nothing. She wore an oil-stained jumpsuit over simpler clothes, goggles pushed up onto her forehead, her fingers moving with deft precision as she manipulated a complex assembly held in a micromanipulator rig. She had not changed fundamentally, yet she was undeniably more. The fierce intelligence had deepened, the confidence solidified. She was not just building things anymore. She was commanding principles. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her for a moment, letting the simple, grounding act of observing my daughter settle my own turbulent thoughts. This visit was not a reunion. Despite the intensity of the past 2 years, I had maintained contact, snatching precious hours whenever the brutal training schedule allowed. Those visits had been lifelines, brief moments of normalcy grounding me, reminding me why we endured the crucible. But this time felt different, heavier. This was not a pause during the preparation. It was the pause before the strike. She must have sensed my presence, some subtle shift in the room's energy registering even through her intense focus. Without looking up, she spoke, her voice slightly muffled by concentration. If you are just going to stand there radiating imminent showdown vibes, at least make yourself useful. Hand me the gravimetric stabilizer, the Mark IV. A small smile touched my lips despite the gravity weighing on me. Some things had not changed. I located the requested component amidst the organized clutter. Stella's chaos always possessed its own elegant internal logic, and placed it gently in her outstretched hand. Imminent showdown vibes? I queried mildly. I thought I was projecting quiet paternal admiration. She finally glanced up, a spark of amusement in her dark eyes, quickly replaced by her usual sharp assessment as she took in my travel-worn appearance, the faint psychic residue clinging to my aura, the deeper stillness that had settled into my core since achieving peak radiant. 5 out of 10 on the admiration, 10 out of 10 on the just confirmed the location of the universe-ending threat and am mentally preparing for a one-way trip scale. Did she send another talking letter? Her perception was unnerving. Something like that, I admitted vaguely. She accepted this with a nod, turning back to her work, trusting I would share what was necessary. Our communication had found its own rhythm, an understanding built on love, trust, and the unavoidable reality of the dangers I faced. How is the K-Driver Prototype 4 performing under simulated load? I asked, gesturing towards the device she was integrating the stabilizer into. Her face lit up immediately, the familiar passion chasing away the shadows. Exceeding projections, she declared, activating a holographic display showing complex performance graphs. The multi-layered composite substrate with embedded frequency dampeners completely mitigated the harmonic resonance cascade. We are seeing 92% energy efficiency on kinetic conversion, which is, frankly, absurd. She grinned, a flash of pure, unadulterated scientific joy. Elegant, right? Elegant was a profound understatement. It was revolutionary. Her ability to devise solutions operating entirely outside the mana-based paradigms that dominated this world's science was a constant source of awe. It is beyond elegant, Stell, I said sincerely. It is groundbreaking. The familiar frustration resurfaced, the institutional inertia, the rigid adherence to mana affinity prerequisites that kept this brilliant mind confined to homeschooling and private labs instead of leading global research initiatives. She shrugged, dismissing the implied criticism of the system with pragmatic indifference. Keeps me focused. Besides, the Slatemark kids are surprisingly competent sparring partners for theoretical work, even if they insist on trying to solve everything with runes first. She smirked. Turns out, being the genius inventor daughter of the second hero gets you a lot of leeway, even if you keep accidentally crashing their simulation networks. I chuckled, picturing the chaos she likely caused. Her connections with students at Slatemark Academy provided a valuable, if unconventional, peer group. Just try not to start any virtual interdimensional wars, I advised dryly. Working on it, she replied cheerfully, carefully locking the stabilizer into place. She ran a quick diagnostic, her eyes scanning the flowing data streams. Perfect integration. Phase 1 complete. She powered down the rig and finally turned to face me fully on the stool, her earlier levity fading completely as she truly looked at me, her perceptive gaze cutting straight through my carefully maintained composure, sensing the finality in my presence this time. Okay, she said quietly, her voice losing its playful edge. What is it, Daddy? You feel different, quieter, but also louder, like a storm gathering just over the horizon. I hesitated. The instinct to shield her, to soften the blow, was strong. But she deserved the truth. She had lived under the shadow of this threat for 2 years. She had earned the right to know the stakes. The time for preparation is over, Stell, I said, my voice steady, meeting her serious gaze directly. The waiting, the training, it has all led to this. I know where Alisara is. I am going to confront her. She absorbed this, her expression becoming very still. No tears, no panic. Just a profound, unnerving quietness as she processed the immense weight of my words. Alone? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Initially, yes, I confirmed. Her power works in ways. It targets connections, vulnerabilities. Going in force would put everyone else in unacceptable danger. This first step, it has to be mine. She nodded slowly, understanding the grim strategic necessity far better than any 15-year-old should have to. Is it? She swallowed, searching for the right words. Is this the final battle? The one you have been preparing for? It is the necessary battle, I corrected gently. The one that determines if we get to fight the final one later. It is a battle to the death, Stell. One way or another. She closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing that stark finality. When she opened them again, they were clear, focused, filled not with fear, but with a fierce, unwavering belief that mirrored my own resolve. She slid off the stool and walked over to me, wrapping her arms around my waist, holding on tight. "Okay," she whispered against my chest. "Okay, Daddy." She pulled back slightly, looking up at me, her small hands gripping my arms. "Just win. Win and come home. Promise me." "I promise I will do everything in my power to come home," I said, my voice thick with emotion I couldn't entirely suppress. I could offer no guarantees against a foe like Alisara, but the intent, the absolute commitment behind the promise was real. She searched my face for a long moment, then seemed to accept this as the only truth I could offer. She nodded once, firmly. "Okay. Anti-gravity cake is still on the menu for 16, though. Don't be late." A raw laugh escaped me then, breaking the tension, grounding me in the beautiful absurdity of her unwavering focus. "Wouldn't miss it for anything," I promised sincerely. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, not dwelling on the impending battle, but immersing ourselves in the precious normalcy of her world. I helped her run low-power tests on the integrated K-driver, marveling at the quiet hum of its near-perfect efficiency. We ate nutrient bars sitting cross-legged on the lab floor, debating the questionable physics depicted in her favorite sci-fi holo-series. She walked me through the complex safety protocols for her mostly non-explosive elevator concept, her enthusiasm infectious. It was simple, ordinary, and utterly vital. Each shared moment, each easy laugh, felt like reinforcing the anchor chain connecting me to this life, to the light I was fighting to protect. As evening bled into night, casting long shadows across the cluttered lab, a comfortable quiet settled between us again. Stella leaned against my shoulder as we sat on an old sofa she used for thinking, watching the city lights ignite outside the massive window, a familiar, comforting constellation. "Love you, Daddy," she murmured, her voice soft, already tinged with the drowsiness of a long day spent wrestling with complex ideas. "Love you too, little star," I replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, my heart aching with the sheer, fierce weight of that love. This was it, the anchor point, the reason distilled down to its purest, most undeniable form. Not abstract notions of duty or the title of hero, but this specific, brilliant, stubborn, incredible girl, and the bright future she deserved to build in a world free from the suffocating shadows that gathered beyond our windows. I held her until her breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, then carefully lifted her, surprised again by how much she had grown, and carried her to her room. After tucking her in, surrounding her with the comforting clutter of her ongoing projects, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, fixing the image of her peaceful face firmly in my mind, a shield against the darkness to come. Then, I turned and walked back towards the main living area. The quiet penthouse felt different now, charged with a new, final sense of purpose. The internal crucible wasn't waiting anymore. The external one was. The path ahead was perilous, the outcome uncertain. But the anchor held fast. It was time. Alisara hummed a cheerful, nonsensical tune, the sound oddly bright against the imagined backdrop of wherever this was. She moved with practiced ease, tying the crisp white apron behind her back. Her pink hair, usually a wild storm, was gathered. A simple tie held momentarily between plump, glossed lips before securing the vibrant mass into a loose, functional bun. "Done," the soft declaration hung in the warm air as she turned to the gleaming countertop. A large knife felt comfortable in her hand. Vegetables yielded beneath the blade with satisfying snaps and slices carrots, celery, onions falling into neat piles before being swept into a huge pot already simmering on a high-tech stovetop. Steam rose, carrying the rich aroma of stock and herbs. For the next hour, The kitchen was filled with the quiet, domestic rhythm of her movements. Stirring, tasting, adding a pinch of spice here, a dash of something there. Her jade eyes were bright, focused entirely on the task, a picture of serene contentment. The stew bubbling in the pot smelled incredible, complex, and deeply comforting. After a final taste, a satisfied nod, she reduced the heat, letting it simmer gently. A soft sigh escaped her lips as she stretched languidly, arms reaching high. She padded silently on bare feet into the adjoining living room. A cheerful fire crackled merrily in a large, fieldstone hearth, casting dancing shadows on comfortable-looking sofas and thick, plush rugs. Kneeling gracefully, she added several more logs, coaxing the flames higher, the warmth radiating outwards, chasing away a chill only she seemed to perceive. The entire space glowed cozy, safe, utterly peaceful. Perfect haven. After watching the flames twist and curl for a few minutes, lost in thought, she returned to the kitchen, gave the stew one last stir, and ladled a small amount onto a spoon. Blowing gently, she took a delicate sip. Her eyes lit up with unfeigned delight, a pink tongue darting out to catch a stray drop. Perfect. As if choreographed, the gentle chime of a doorbell echoed through the quiet house. A brilliant smile instantly transformed Alisara's face, reaching deep into her jade eyes, making them sparkle with genuine, unbridled anticipation. She quickly untied the apron, letting it fall onto a nearby chair, smoothed down the simple, soft fabric of her dress, and almost skipped towards the entryway, arms already opening wide. The heavy wooden door swung inward smoothly at her approach. Arthur. The name was a breath of pure joy, her voice taking on an even more musical, welcoming tone. She launched herself forward without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face against his chest in a tight, possessive hug. He stood solid and real in the doorway, impeccably dressed dark suit, crisp white shirt, muted tie, the very image of a beloved husband returning home after a long, wearying day. His arms came around her waist, almost automatically, holding her close for a beat. Solid, warm, hers. Her heart gave a happy little skip against his chest. She pulled back just enough to beam up at him, eyes dancing with playful, affectionate light. "Welcome home, hubby," she purred, her voice soft and intimate. "Long day? What do you need first? There is a pot of stew that simmered just for you. A nice hot bath waiting to soak away the world, or—" Her gaze flickered downwards suggestively for the briefest instant before locking back onto his, full of playful promise. "Me?" Arthur looked down at her. His expression was calm, perhaps tired around the eyes, but his gaze held a faint, unreadable softness as he took in her welcoming smile, the warmth of the home she had apparently prepared. "Dinner sounds good, Alisara," he responded, his voice even quiet. "Dinner it is," she chirped brightly, her earlier assumptions seemingly confirmed by his easy acceptance. His reciprocal hug. She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his naturally, and led him away from the door, towards the dining area set near the inviting fireplace. She chattered happily as they walked, recounting small, invented anecdotes about her day, a minor disaster with a dropped spice jar, the pleasant quiet of the afternoon, her anticipation of his return. They sat down at the beautifully set table. She served the stew, ladling generous portions into heavy earthenware bowls, the rich aroma filling the air. They ate in companionable silence for a few moments, the only sounds the cheerful crackling of the fire and the gentle clink of spoons against the bowls. The stew was, objectively, delicious, perfectly seasoned, tender vegetables, savory broth. A meal made with care. "So, tell me about your day," Alisara prompted, breaking the quiet, her tone light, full of genuine interest, leaning forward slightly. Was Director Thorne finally reasonable about the Sector 7 budget allocation? "Long," Arthur replied, focusing on his stew for a moment before meeting her gaze briefly. "Productive. And yes, eventually, after the usual." She laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to warm the room even more than the fire. He does love his procedural debates. Honestly, darling, you really should learn to delegate those tedious budget meetings. Think of the hours you would save. The conversation continued easily, falling into the comfortable, familiar cadence of a couple intimately acquainted with the rhythms of each other's lives. She asked about specific projects, mentioned colleagues by name, referenced past shared jokes or frustrations. Her performance was flawless, utterly convincing because, from her perspective, it was real. He had hugged her. He was eating her stew. He was home. Arthur played his part, offering quiet, non-committal responses, letting her fill the silences, his own thoughts carefully shielded behind a mask of weary acceptance. The perfection of the scene, the sheer normality of it, felt subtly, jarringly wrong, like a melody played slightly off-key. After they finished, Alisara gathered the empty bowls with a satisfied sigh. "You go relax by the fire, hubby," she instructed warmly, already moving towards the kitchen sink. "I will handle these few dishes in a moment, and then I will draw you that nice hot bath. You look like you could melt away the day." Arthur watched her go, watched the effortless domesticity, the serene contentment radiating from her. He rose from the table, but instead of heading towards the beckoning warmth of the fireplace, he followed her into the equally perfect, warm kitchen. He leaned against the doorframe, observing her as she began rinsing the bowls under warm running water, humming that same cheerful, nonsensical tune. "Alisara," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the humming, through the illusion of normalcy, like a shard of ice. She paused mid-motion, glancing back at him over her shoulder, a small, questioning smile on her face, seemingly expecting a compliment or a request. "Yes, Arthur? Did you forget something?" "Stop it," he stated plainly, his voice gaining a slight edge. "This performance, this meticulously crafted illusion." He gestured, not angrily, but with a weary finality, encompassing the warm kitchen, the scent of stew, the entire fabricated reality. "It is not real. I know what this is. Your power, fantasy, control." She turned fully then, slowly drying her hands on a soft towel, her smile faltering, replaced by an expression of genuine, deep hurt and confusion. "Fantasy?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, her jade eyes wide, searching his face. "Arthur, how can you say that? This is us. This is real. You came home. You hugged me." The last words were almost an accusation, the desperate plea of someone whose carefully constructed reality was being denied. "This is what we could have. What we should have had. What we could have had died a lifetime ago," Arthur replied, his voice hardening, refusing the emotional bait. "This construct, however detailed, however much you wish it were real, is not. You brought my consciousness here against my will. Now the game is over. Let me go." The hurt in her eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a desperate, fervent intensity. She realized her initial assumption, that his compliance meant acceptance, was wrong. Her strategy shifted in a heartbeat. She stepped closer, invading his space, her divine aura subtly flaring, pressing against him not as an attack, but as a persuasive force. "But why would you want to leave?" she pleaded, her voice dropping, becoming soft, seductive, hypnotic. "I am not trapping you, Arthur. Can't you see? I am offering you sanctuary, a choice, a release from that endless, thankless burden you carry." Her hand came up, resting lightly, proprietarily, on his chest, over his heart. "Think about it. No more fighting, no more loss, no more watching everyone you try to protect suffer and inevitably die. Here, we can have anything your heart desires." Her voice became a silken whisper, weaving impossible promises directly into his mind, amplified by her divine power. "My power, it allows me to shape this reality to our exact specifications. More than that," she leaned closer, her eyes holding his captive, her breath warm against his cheek. "I can manipulate time itself within this haven. I can stretch a single, perfect second into an eternity. We could live 1,000 lifetimes together, Arthur, experience every joy, every peace, every simple happiness we were ever denied, all in the space of a single breath outside this perfect world. We can finally have the life we were supposed to have. Her eyes shone with a terrifying, absolute conviction, a goddess utterly convinced of the righteousness of her desire. The happiness that was stolen from us, back when we were Arthur and Emma. The names resonated, ghosts summoned to bolster her argument. The offer itself, an escape from the crushing weight of his reality, an eternity of peace with a phantom echo of a lost love, was a potent, insidious temptation, tailored perfectly to his deepest scars. She truly believed this cage was a gift. He remained silent for a long, heavy moment, letting her desperate, beautiful, poisonous pitch hang in the air between them. He searched her eyes, seeing past the divine power to the fractured soul beneath. The lonely godling convinced this suffocating obsession was the only path to fulfillment. Then, gently but firmly, he removed her hand from his chest. "And what happens to them, Alisara?" he asked quietly, his voice devoid of anger or judgment, filled only with a deep, unshakable, sorrowful certainty. She blinked, the question momentarily disrupting her fervent persuasion. "Them? Who?" "My fiancés," he stated plainly, naming them one by one, each name a quiet assertion of a reality she sought to erase. "Luna, Cecilia, Serafina, Rachel, Rose, Reka. What happens to them while we live our 1,000 lifetimes hidden away in your perfect eternity?" He took a small step back, creating a necessary distance, his gaze never leaving hers. "What about Stella? My daughter? My parents? My friends? Rin? Lucifer? What becomes of the world, our world, that we leave behind?" Alisara's expression shuddered instantly, the pleading warmth vanishing without a trace, replaced by a chillingly cold, almost bored indifference. She didn't need to speak. He saw the answer starkly, unequivocally, in her eyes. They were sacrifices, irrelevant variables to be deleted from the equation in service of her perfect, isolated fantasy with him alone. "You do not understand the choice you are making," Arthur continued, his voice low, heavy with the weight of the future she so callously disregarded. "Even if I desired this, which I assure you, I do not, accepting your offer, staying here, abandoning them, it would be their death sentence. All of them." He looked past her then, his gaze seeming to pierce the comforting, illusory walls of the kitchen, focusing on the inevitable, catastrophic storm gathering beyond this fragile, self-serving haven. "There are threats coming, Alisara. Forces that make even your considerable power seem manageable by comparison. Without me there, without all of us standing together as imperfectly and frustratingly as we do, they will fall. Everything I have fought for, everyone I love, will be consumed by darkness. Then let them be consumed." Alisara finally snapped, her carefully constructed composure shattering completely, revealing the cold, ruthless, solipsistic core beneath the layers of yearning and twisted affection. "Why should their insignificant fates concern us? We would be here, Arthur, together, safe, forever. Nothing else matters but our happiness." "They matter to me," Arthur stated, the words simple, absolute, irrefutable. They struck the very foundation of her meticulously crafted fantasy like a seismic charge. "My life, my family, my responsibilities, they are not burdens I seek to escape. They are the reason I endure. They are what define me, and I will never abandon them. Not for you. Not for any promise of peace bought at their expense." His refusal was absolute, unwavering, final. He had rejected her offer, rejected her vision, rejected her. The illusion, sustained by her divine will but ultimately predicated on the fragile, now shattered, hope of his eventual acceptance, began to visibly destabilize under the sheer force of his conviction. A violent tremor ran through the floor beneath their feet, rattling the dishes still in the sink. The warm light from the fireplace flickered erratically, casting lurching, distorted shadows. The comforting aroma of stew was abruptly, sickeningly replaced by the sterile smell of ozone and the cold, empty pressure Arthur recognized from his brief clash with her projected power. Cracks, thin as hairs at first, then rapidly widening like jagged bolts of lightning, spiderwebbed across the perfect kitchen walls, revealing glimpses not of gray void, but of a stark, cold, and undeniably hostile reality beyond the alien architecture of her true inner sanctum. Alisara stared at him, her beautiful face contorted with a mixture of disbelief, incandescent fury, and a dawning, terrible, wounded agony. "No!" she whispered, the sound raw, broken, unwilling to accept his rejection, unwilling to let her perfect, painstakingly crafted fantasy die. She raised her hands, divine power flaring around her like a crimson storm, intending perhaps to deepen the illusion, to reinforce its crumbling walls, to force his compliance through sheer conceptual weight. But Arthur acted first. Seeing she would not release him willingly, recognizing the shift from persuasion to coercion, he unleashed his own power, not defensively but assertively. He didn't erupt with destructive force. He focused inward, then outward, drawing on the core principles he had spent 2 years honing to their peak. Gray power surged, not as an attack, but as an absolute, irrefutable assertion of objective truth, a conceptual counterfrequency to her fantasy. Lucent harmony resonated outwards, demanding fundamental balance, actively rejecting the imposed, unbalanced narrative of her world. Soul resonance pulsed, reinforcing his connection to his own identity, his own reality, severing the subtle psychic tendrils she had woven around his consciousness. "Enough," he commanded, his voice quiet but resonating with the full weight of his peak radiant authority, amplified by the absolute certainty of his conviction. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The illusory kitchen, the warm house, the fireplace, the scent of stew, the entire meticulously crafted domestic fantasy. It shattered like brittle, supercooled glass struck by a sonic hammer. The fragile illusion of hearth and home shattered violently around Arthur like fractured glass, dissolving not into gentle motes but into sharp, glittering fragments of light and shadow. The comforting warmth vanished instantly, replaced by the stark, cold, and fundamentally alien geometry of Alisara's true inner sanctum. Non-Euclidean angles met smooth, featureless surfaces wrought from materials that seemed to drink the ambient light, creating an unsettling, almost lightless environment despite the lack of distinct shadows. The air was thin, carrying the faint, cloying perfume of roses underscored by something metallic, like ozone or old blood, and the low, dissonant thrum of immense, contained divine power. Alisara stood before him amidst the conceptual debris of her broken fantasy. The simple dress and apron were gone, replaced by flowing crimson silks that seemed less like fabric and more like solidified desire, rippling slightly in an unfelt breeze. The serene mask of domestic contentment had vanished, replaced first by disbelief and wounded fury, then swiftly by a chillingly predatory amusement. A goddess contemplating a toy that had unexpectedly proven more interesting than anticipated. Complete control, Arthur thought, the single quote a point of cold focus amidst the disorienting shift. Reality warping, her innate gift, manifesting as the crimson threads. And fantasy control, evolved from Lysantra's stolen lust. Combined, they allow her to impose her will, her narrative, onto reality itself. Understanding the interplay, the seams between these two aspects, was key. "You should have listened," Alisara said, her voice soft again, but stripped of its forced warmth, now holding only a silken, dangerous edge. Her delicate fingers, radiating a subtle crimson glow that spoke of barely contained power, reached out and touched Arthur's chest lightly, directly over the conceptual space where his sword heart resided. "You should have yielded when the offer was gentle. You should have submitted. I would have loved you, Arthur, cherished you, given you an eternity of peace without pain." Her expression hardened fractionally, the amusement momentarily overshadowed by possessive resolve. "But it seems violence is the necessary catalyst for your understanding, after all. So I will break you." He felt it then, not a physical pressure, but an invasive, conceptual intrusion originating from her touch. Thin, almost imperceptible crimson threads, born from her will, attempted to phase directly into his body, aiming for the core of his power structure, seeking to shut down his sword heart, to neutralize him from within. Arthur scoffed audibly, the sound sharp with disdain in the quiet sanctum. A silent, focused pulse of gray power, directed inward with absolute precision, met the invading threads the instant they manifested within him. It was not a clash. It was pure negation. The threads, potent manifestations of her reality control, simply ceased to exist upon contact with the objective truth asserted by the gray. They unraveled into harmless nothingness before they could exert any influence. Seizing the fractional moment of her surprise, a subtle widening of her jade eyes as her internal attack simply vanished, Arthur moved decisively. His hand shot out, faster than her divine senses anticipated given his previous restraint, grabbing her outstretched arm just above the wrist. He pulled her abruptly off balance, using her own forward momentum to bring her stumbling into his immediate space. Her divine resilience meant the pull itself caused no harm, but the sudden, unexpected proximity, the violation of her controlled distance, clearly startled her. He leaned in close, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, letting his words carry not just sound, but the subtle, resonating vibration of soul resonance, a focused projection of his own unwavering identity designed to bypass any lingering mental defenses or illusions. "Do I still look like that naive kid who just barely killed a fledgling calamity, Alisara?" He whispered, the name itself a deliberate, calculated challenge, referencing a past victory she likely considered insignificant. Her shocked expression morphed instantly, unpredictably, not into the expected fury, but into a sudden, incandescent, almost manic joy that was far more disturbing. A genuine, radiant smile spread across her face, reaching deep into her jade eyes, making them sparkle with unsettling fervor. "Arthur," she breathed, her voice filled with a newfound excitement. Her free hand came up, slender fingers tracing the line of his chin with possessive tenderness, tilting his face up so she could stare directly into his azure eyes. "You hide your depths well. You have become strong." There was a dangerous thrill in her voice now, the predatory excitement of a being who had finally found a worthy opponent, or perhaps a worthy prize. Before he could react to this disconcerting shift, she flowed against him with impossible grace, pressing her cheek against his, her earlier surprise completely forgotten, replaced by a possessive, almost playful intimacy that set his teeth on edge. "Oh, you pulled my arm down quite forcefully," she murmured, a light, theatrical moan escaping her lips as his grip inadvertently tightened in reflexive response to her unwelcome proximity. "Ah, you were quite rough, Art." His brow twitched involuntarily. This constant, jarring oscillation between lethal divine threat and cloying, manipulative intimacy was deeply unsettling, clearly a deliberate tactic designed to keep him psychologically off balance. He reacted instinctively, pulling back fractionally while maintaining his grip and driving his free fist towards her face, a straightforward, powerful punch, amplified not just by his peak radiant physical strength, but infused conceptually with the chilling, entropic energy of deep dark, borrowed from Erebus's connection for an added layer of disruptive, unmaking bite. "You can be rough?" Alisara purred, spinning away with impossible, fluid grace that seemed to defy inertia, seemingly anticipating the punch nanoseconds before it was fully thrown. She used his own forward momentum, pulling lightly on his extended arm to guide his trajectory harmlessly past her into empty air, simultaneously breaking his grip. But punching? So crude. Simply domestic abuse, darling. She reappeared instantly beside him in the same fluid motion, her cheek brushing against his again from the other side, her proximity unnerving, mocking his failed attack. "Besides," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear, carrying that faint, cloying scent of roses. "My face is far too pretty to punch, wouldn't you agree?" Enough of this game. Arthur needed objective data on her physical resilience, her reactions under genuine pressure, not just conceptual games. He shifted his stance instantly, twisting her captured arm as she spun past, leveraging his immense strength against the delicate-seeming bones of her wrist, applying just enough focused force, amplified by a microburst of targeted gravitational increase via harmony, to elicit a sharp intake of breath, a genuine wince of pain that momentarily broke through her playful, untouchable facade. She instantly ripped her arm free, not with brute strength, but with a flicker of warped space that simply negated his grip, and distanced herself several feet, her eyes narrowing slightly, the predatory amusement replaced by a flicker of genuine annoyance. The pain, however minor, was clearly an unexpected, unwelcome intrusion into her carefully controlled narrative. "Oh, you dash," she began, the teasing tone returning automatically, likely preparing another verbal barb or a more serious conceptual counterattack designed to punish his impudence. Arthur didn't let her finish. He needed to keep pressing, keep disrupting her rhythm, keep forcing her beyond mere reaction. He lunged forward again, his hand reaching not for her arm, not for her face, but directly towards her chest, aiming for her conceptual core, the focal point from which her divine power emanated. "How naughty!" Alisara chided, her annoyance vanishing as quickly as it appeared, replaced once again by that infuriating, condescending amusement. She didn't block, didn't parry. She simply shifted, warping space around herself with effortless, instantaneous thought, her complete control demonstrating absolute mastery over local geometry. One moment she was within reach, the next she was 10 feet away across the alien chamber, then 5 feet to his left, hovering slightly off the featureless floor, then appearing directly behind him, always maintaining the exact same frustrating distance, her movements fluid, seamless, mocking his attempts to engage directly. Arthur mirrored her actions for a few exchanges, pushing his own gray-fueled spatial manipulation to its absolute limits. He folded space, executed short-range dimensional shifts, attempted to predict her movements using the microsecond precognition afforded by his attunement to time and amplified perception. But it was like chasing a reflection in a constantly warping, actively hostile mirror. His control, while peak radiant and incredibly refined, required conscious calculation, a finite processing time, however small. Hers felt innate, reflexive, as natural and instantaneous as her own thoughts. He could match her speed for fleeting instants, but he couldn't close the final gap. She always adjusted faster, effortlessly maintaining that buffer zone, turning the confrontation into a frustrating, draining game of spatial tag he couldn't win through conventional pursuit. Her innate reality control is orders of magnitude more efficient than my gray manipulation for this kind of reactive, high-speed spatial maneuvering, Arthur analyzed grimly, forcing himself to remain calm despite the growing, calculated frustration. Direct physical pursuit is futile. Need to change the approach. Need to force her engagement differently. He deliberately stopped his pursuit, letting a carefully controlled hint of frustration show on his face, playing into the role of the overwhelmed, outmatched opponent she seemed to expect, perhaps even desire. "Come on, Alisara," he called out, injecting a subtle note of strained exasperation, a calculated vulnerability into his voice. "Stop dancing around. Afraid to face me directly? Let me touch you." It was a crude gamble, a blatant psychological ploy aimed directly at her arrogance, her possessiveness, her desire not just to win, but to dominate utterly, to prove her superiority through direct, controlling contact. For a single, almost imperceptible instant, her fluid spatial shifting stuttered. Her mind, perhaps momentarily caught between the ingrained desire to maintain absolute control over distance and the instinctive, predatory urge to accept his apparent challenge, experienced a fractional lag in its command over the local reality. Her constant warping flickered, just for a picosecond. It was less than a microsecond, an opening invisible, imperceptible to any ordinary senses, even those of most radiance. But Arthur's senses, amplified by peak radiant power, honed by 2 years of relentless training under Alice, and focused entirely on finding such a seam, registered the flicker. And his intent, honed by countless life-or-death battles, was absolute. Now, his fingers, already reaching from his last failed lunge, didn't need to physically traverse the remaining distance. Leveraging the momentary infinitesimal instability in her spatial control, he activated no distance, not brute force teleportation, but the conceptual assertion of location without travel, location without permission one. His palm wasn't moving towards her. It simply was, instantaneously, where it needed to be. His fingertips brushed the surprisingly cool, almost static-charged fabric of her crimson silk dress, just above her stomach. Not goo-her thought, broadcasted unintentionally by her sheer shock at the impossible, intimate contact, cut off abruptly. Arthur closed his fist, pushing forward simultaneously, completing the 0-inch punch. It wasn't about raw physical power. It was about focused, conceptual impact, delivered directly to her core before her defenses could fully reassert, bypassing her spatial buffer entirely. His knuckles connected solidly against the surprising tension, the subtle resistance, of her divine form. Ow! Alisara breathed, a sharp, genuine sound of pain and utter surprise escaping her lips. A flicker of disorientation, of disbelief, crossed her perfect features. The punch itself, while carrying immense focused force, was unlikely to be truly devastating to her divine resilience, perhaps akin to a solid blow against tempered celestial bronze. But the fact that it had landed cleanly, that he had somehow bypassed her absolute spatial control, that he had touched her against her will when she believed herself untouchable, clearly shocked and infuriated her on a fundamental, conceptual level. The playful, condescending amusement vanished instantly, completely, replaced by a glacial, terrifying fury that radiated outwards, chilling the very air. She reacted with blinding, reflexive speed, divine power erupting around her. Her hand lashed out, grabbing his punching arm with inhuman strength far exceeding her delicate appearance, twisting it brutally, aiming to snap the bone cleanly at the elbow. Simultaneously, Arthur felt the familiar, insidious crawl of her crimson threads attempting to infiltrate his arm, seeking not just to inflict pain, but to suppress his natural regeneration, to ensure the damage was permanent, a lasting, humiliating mark of her displeasure. Crack! A sickening sound echoed sharply in the unnaturally quiet chamber. Alisara ripped his arm off at the shoulder with a snarl of triumphant fury, or rather what she thought was his arm. Instead of flesh, blood, and bone, she held a disconnected collection of blackened, ancient-looking skeletal fragments, held together tenuously by flickering strands of dark, entropic energy. Erebus's bones, projected, solidified, and subtly substituted for Arthur's real arm via gray spatial manipulation just nanoseconds before her grip fully tightened and the brutal twist occurred. A minor construct, a calculated sacrifice, offered up to avoid a debilitating injury while gathering more data on her physical strength and reaction patterns. Alisara stared at the skeletal limb crumbling rapidly in her hand, her fury momentarily displaced by confusion, then by a flicker of grudging, almost impressed acknowledgement. A cute trick, she conceded, crushing the bones to fine, iridescent powder with a contemptuous squeeze. The dark energy dissipated harmlessly into the controlled atmosphere. Using your pet Lich King as a convenient spare parts depot? Why don't you bring that darling Skullboy out to play properly? Let's see how he fares against true divinity. I am not stupid enough to feed him to you, Arthur retorted calmly, flexing his real arm, which he had retracted fractionally during the substitution, the gray power within already smoothing over the minor conceptual strain of the rapid, complex maneuver. Erebus was a powerful ally, a Lich King of considerable might, but against a divine entity wielding complete control. His role was purely auxiliary distractions, decoys, subtle manipulations from the relative safety of his shadow dimension. Direct confrontation would result in his immediate, permanent destruction. Alisara contemptuously tossed the swirling bone dust aside. The brief flicker of pain and surprise from the 0-inch punch was completely gone now, replaced by a colder, sharper, more dangerous focus. The playful testing, the manipulative dance, the psychological games, all seemed definitively over. Her aura intensified dramatically, the subtle pressure becoming a tangible, suffocating weight once more, the very air growing thick and resistant around her. The temperature in the alien sanctum dropped noticeably, a chill that had nothing to do with physical cold and everything to do with her rising divine wrath. Her form began to subtly shimmer, less sharply defined, the crimson silks seeming to bleed into the fabric of reality itself, her eyes glowing with a dangerous, internal light that promised annihilation. "Very well, Arthur," her mental voice echoed, stripped bare of its earlier warmth or manipulative amusement, resonating now with chilling, absolute power and a hint of genuine rage at his impudence, his refusal to play by her rules. "You wished to touch divinity. You succeeded. You landed your clever little blow. Are you satisfied? Did you learn what you needed to learn during our brief engagement?" Her aura flared, pressing down with suffocating force, far exceeding anything Arthur had felt before, even during the initial confrontation moments ago. "Because the lesson is now concluded. Playtime is definitively finished." The playful, predatory amusement vanished from Alisara's face, replaced by a cold, frighteningly impersonal focus. The alien sanctum, which had been static and silent, seemed to take a sharp, indrawn breath in response to her shift in mood. The very air grew thick, resistant, charged with a power that prickled against Arthur's skin. "Playtime," her mental voice echoed, stripped bare of its earlier warmth, "is definitively finished." She did not move. She did not need to. The environment itself became her weapon. The non-Euclidean angles of the walls seemed to sharpen, the featureless surfaces rippling as if they were muscle tissue. With a low, groaning sound that was felt more in the bones than heard, the sanctum attacked. Two opposing walls, hundreds of meters apart, simply detached from the concept of stillness and surged inwards, intending to crush Arthur between them like an insect. They moved with terrifying, unnatural speed, not bound by conventional physics, but driven by her absolute will. Arthur reacted instantly. Standard evasion is useless. He didn't try to outrun them, he folded space. A gray seam tore open at his feet, and he dropped through it, reappearing 60 meters above, the two massive walls slamming together beneath him with a sound that seemed to shatter reality itself, sending conceptual shrapnel through the space he had just occupied. He hung suspended in the air for only a microsecond, his peak radiant senses already scanning for the next threat. Came immediately. The very gravity of the sanctum, now fully under her command, seized him. It didn't just increase. It reversed, yanking him violently towards the ceiling. Simultaneously, she layered in the other aspect of her power. As he hurtled upwards, his equilibrium compromised. A fleeting but perfectly rendered image flashed through his perception. Stella, her face pale with terror, hands outstretched, screaming his name as she fell from a great height. The 1-2 punch of physical manipulation and targeted psychic assault was brutal. The flash of fantasy, designed to evoke a primal, protective fear, caused an infinitesimal hesitation in his response. In that instant, the reversed gravity slammed him against the ceiling with the force of a freight train. The impact sent a painful jolt through his entire body, and though his passively reinforced form absorbed the worst of it, he felt ribs creak in protest. Before he could reorient, the crimson threads, no longer probes but thick, surging cables of solidified intent, erupted from the ceiling around him. They wrapped around his limbs, his torso, his neck, binding him, crushing him against the featureless surface. This is her true power, Arthur thought, his mind racing, fighting the disorientation, analyzing the assault. Overwhelming, simultaneous application of both reality and fantasy control. No wasted motion, pure efficiency. He flared his power. A localized pulse of gray negation vaporized the threads binding him, the concept of unbound momentarily overriding her control. He dropped from the ceiling, landing in a crouch on the floor, which had now settled back into its original position. He was breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the sheer mental strain of processing and countering the layered assault. He stood in the center of the vast, cold chamber. Alisara was nowhere to be seen, yet she was everywhere. The sanctum was her body, her will made manifest. Impressive, her voice echoed, seeming to come from the walls themselves. You resisted a force that could pulverize mountains and a vision that could break a weaker mind. But that, Arthur, was merely the opening movement. The floor beneath him dissolved. Not into a pit, but into a churning, viscous sea of crimson threads, each one lashing out, seeking purchase. He was forced into the air, levitating under his own power, a single, isolated target. Then came the true assault. From every direction, walls, ceiling, the sea of threads below her power converged. Massive spikes of the alien architecture detached and flew at him like javelins. Crimson threads formed into vast, complex nets, attempting to ensnare him. Spatial distortions flickered around him, trying to misdirect his evasive maneuvers. And all the while, the fantasy assault continued, a relentless barrage of whispers, phantom sounds, fleeting images of his fiancées in peril, each one designed to fray his nerves, to divide his focus, to find a single crack in his defenses. He moved in a desperate three-dimensional dance. This was combat on a level he had only touched upon in his most intense simulations with Alice. He was a singularity of controlled chaos. His peak radiant power stretched to its absolute limit. He used gray spatial folding not just to move, but to redirect. He would open a seam just as a javelin of warped stone reached him, sending it harmlessly into a pocket dimension. He channeled the principles of his refined Grade 6 arts, using the essence of still tempest to create microbursts of gray energy, negating clusters of threads at a time. He anchored his mind with lucent harmony, the assertion of objective truth a frail but functional shield against her constant psychic barbs, allowing him to differentiate between true threats and illusory ones. But it was a losing battle. He was only one man, and she was the entire world around him. For every attack he negated, 3 more took its place. For every illusion he dismissed, a new, more insidious one flickered at the edge of his perception. His energy reserves, though vast, were finite. Hers, tied to the divine, felt infinite. He misjudged a spatial warp. A crimson thread, thick as his arm, slipped past his defenses and lashed across his chest. It didn't just cut. It burned, the conceptual power of her control searing his skin and attempting to sever his internal energy flow. He roared in pain, a pulse of gray vaporizing the thread as he recoiled, a deep, angry red welt rising instantly on his torso. He was bleeding. He had taken his first significant hit. The assault paused, momentarily. Arthur floated, breathing hard. His hand pressed against the wound, which his body was already struggling to heal against the lingering suppressive energy of her attack. He looked around the vast, empty sanctum, searching. And then he saw her. She stood on a newly formed balcony high up on the wall, looking down at him, her expression unreadable, almost bored. His internal monologue, the voice of doubt he constantly suppressed, rose with venomous clarity. This is impossible. She isn't even trying. She is dismantling me piece by piece from a distance, just to see how I break. How can anyone fight this? How could he have fought this? The despair was cold, heavy, and paralyzing. The world snapped back into focus with a gentle, jarring lack of transition. The cold, alien sanctum, the feeling of divine pressure, the echoing threat in Alisara's voice, all of it vanished, replaced by warmth, a gentle, enveloping warmth that seemed to soak into his very bones, chasing away a chill he hadn't fully realized he was carrying. He was standing in the small, perfect cottage from the first fantasy. The air smelled of old wood, beeswax, and the rich, savory aroma of the stew he had supposedly just been eating. The fireplace crackled merrily in the adjoining room. It was an immediate, immersive assault of peace and domesticity. But this time something was profoundly wrong. He looked down. The polished wooden floorboards were angled at a steep 45 degrees, yet his feet remained planted on them as if the floor were level. The pot of stew sat on the stovetop, simmering, but the stove itself was bolted to the tilted wall, the stew bubbling perpendicular to the floor but perfectly aligned with some unseen, arbitrary down. The air smelled of cooking, but also faintly of roses and the metallic tang of ozone from the sanctum. A conceptual trap, Arthur thought, his mind racing, trying to find an anchor. He was peak radiant, a master of his senses. Yet this place was a sensory nightmare. "Arthur? You're spacing out again," a voice chirped. Emma, or the perfect, tangible projection of her, walked into the kitchen from the living room. She moved with impossible grace, her feet adhering to the tilted floor as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She carried a basket of laundry, her expression one of mild, loving exasperation. "I swear, you'd forget your own head if it wasn't attached. Dinner was lovely, but you barely said a word." He watched her, his senses struggling to reconcile the conflicting information. She felt real. His peak radiant senses registered her warmth, her mass, the subtle displacement of air as she moved. But the environment she inhabited was a logical impossibility, a physical paradox. "Alisara," he stated, his voice flat, testing the construct. The Emma projection paused, a flicker of something cold passing through her eyes, replaced instantly by that same loving smile. "Don't be silly, Arthur." "Emma. Alisara. What's in a name? It's just us." She gestured, and gravity shifted. The down of the room rotated 90 degrees. Arthur stumbled, his equilibrium screaming in protest, catching himself against a wall that now felt like the floor. Emma remained perfectly balanced, her feet now adhering to the new floor, which had been the wall. "This?" Arthur grit his teeth, pushing himself upright against the disorienting pull. "Is not real." "Of course it's real, darling," she cooed, approaching him, her footsteps echoing as if in a vast chamber, though the kitchen was small and cozy. "It's our reality, the one I made for us." This was the new attack, not a subtle seduction, but an active, disorienting, confusing assault. She was layering her powers. The fantasy control provided the emotionally resonant setting, the cottage, the echo of Emma. But her innate reality control was actively, constantly rewriting the fundamental laws of the construct in real time. Gravity was a suggestion. Physics was a guideline she could edit at whim. He tried to anchor himself to find the objective truth. He reached for lucent harmony, seeking the point of balance, the fundamental rightness of an environment. His power floundered, finding no purchase. How could it restore balance to a system whose balance point was in constant, deliberate flux? It was like trying to level a ship in the middle of a typhoon. He tried the gray, his power of negation, his assertion of objective reality. He focused, trying to see through the illusion, to find the seams, the cold sanctum walls he knew must lie beneath. But when he looked at the wall, the gray told him it was a wall. When he focused on the impossible gravity, his power simply reported that this was, in fact, the current, true state of local physics. Alisara wasn't just casting an illusion over his senses. Her complete control was making her fantasy objective reality within this pocket dimension. His powers, which relied on the established laws of reality, were being rendered impotent because she was the one writing those laws. "You look stressed," she whispered, her voice now coming from his own reflection in a polished kettle, though her physical form stood beside him, tracing a finger along his jaw. The sensory contradiction was nauseating. Stop fighting it. It's so much easier to just accept. This was the true horror of her power. It wasn't just the raw force of a god. It was the precision. He recalled the chaotic, primal, overwhelming torrent of power he'd felt from Lysandra in the tower. That was a raw, natural disaster. This was a meticulously engineered one. Alisara had not just refined the stolen power of lust and fantasy. She had integrated it perfectly with her own innate, precise reality control. She wasn't a storm. She was the architect wielding the storm, using its divine energy to power a machine that could rewrite objective law at will. And the realization hit him with a cold, sickening dread far deeper than any physical threat had ever managed. She didn't just refine Lysandra's power, she surpassed her. He had been operating under the assumption that the 7 demon lords and the great 7 leaders represented the ultimate benchmarks of divine power. Lysandra had been one of the more powerful demon lords, but this seamless, adaptive, absolute control over a self-contained reality. This was something else. This was a level of mastery, of integration, that felt fundamentally more advanced, more complete. If Lysandra is a demon lord, and Alisara is now stronger than her, the implication was staggering. Then she's stronger than any of the demon lords. Stronger, perhaps, than the leaders of the Great Seven. The entire strategic framework for the coming war, his understanding of the cosmic power scale, was wrong. He wasn't just facing a god. He was facing a unique, emergent entity who had potentially leapfrogged the established hierarchy, becoming one of the most powerful beings in the universe. And she was entirely, obsessively focused on him. The false Emma smiled, sensing his dawning, paralyzing horror, his internal calculations collapsing. Her embrace felt warmer, more possessive. The warping reality of the cottage seemed to settle, solidifying around this new, shared truth of his helplessness. There now, Alisara's voice whispered, layered over Emma's, triumphant and soothing. You see, don't you? There's no use fighting. The rules are mine. The world is mine. And you are mine. Just accept it. Rest. He stood frozen in the heart of her impossible, perfect, warping cage, checkmated not by force, but by a power that could change the very definition of the game at a whim. The realization, born from the perfect, warping, impossible physics of the illusory cottage, settled over Arthur like a shroud. Alisara had not just refined Lysandra's power. She had surpassed her. This meant she was stronger than any single demon lord, stronger than the leaders of the Great Seven. The entire strategic framework of the world, the balance of power he had come to understand, was meaningless here. He was facing an entity who had, through theft and obsessive refinement, potentially become one of the most powerful beings in existence. And she was toying with him in a magical dollhouse. The Emma projection watched him, her head tilted, a gentle, knowing, pitying smile on her face as she sensed the dawning, paralyzing horror in his mind. The walls of the kitchen were still tilted at an absurd angle, and the gravity still stubbornly pulled him towards a wall. His peak radiant power, his connection to harmony and the gray, felt inert, conceptually checkmated. They were tools designed to function within a system of rules, and she was the author, editor, and publisher of every law in this space. You see, don't you, Arthur? The Emma projection whispered, her voice a soothing balm over his abject terror. It's perfect here. There's no war, no responsibility, no failure, just us. That, more than anything, broke his paralysis. The cold fury of his rejection in the last fantasy, the one he had shattered, returned. He would not be checkmated. He would not be her pet. He pushed off the wall he was standing on, lunging through the disorienting space, his fist pulling back. He ignored the faulty sensory input, focused his intent, and drove a gray-infused punch directly at her. Alisara didn't even flinch. The Emma projection simply smiled. As his fist traveled, the space between them stretched. Not like a visible warp, but subtly, conceptually. He was moving at full speed, yet his target, only a few feet away, seemed to recede, the distance between them becoming an elastic, unbeatable gulf. He was running through molasses, his peak radiant power struggling against her absolute, innate reality control. Then the gravity shifted again. Down became the ceiling. He was suddenly falling upwards. His lunge turned into a helpless tumble. He twisted, using gray spatial manipulation to reorient, but it felt sluggish, like trying to swim through wet concrete. Her control was that absolute. Why do you struggle? Her voice echoed, now seeming to come from the crackling fireplace in the other room. Why do you insist on this path? It only leads to pain. He landed hard against the ceiling, the impact jarring his bones. Crimson threads, no longer playful, but thick as hawsers, erupted from the plaster, lashing around his limbs, binding him. He flared his power, a pulse of gray negation vaporizing them instantly, but more took their place, a relentless, effortless tide. He tore himself free, dropping back to the floor as gravity returned to normal, only for the floor itself to become insubstantial, forcing him to expend energy to keep from falling through into a gray void beneath. He was a rat in a maze designed by a bored god, a maze that rewrote its own walls every second. He was being completely, effortlessly, humiliatingly overpowered. Every art he had spent 2 years refining, every technique he had mastered, was rendered clumsy and useless. His gray mist was dismissed by a thought. His silent cuts unraveled before they could form. His spatial folds were predicted and countered before he even initiated them. She was toying with him, yes, but she was also demonstrating with crushing clarity that his very best was nothing. He was panting, not just from the physical exertion, but from the sheer mental strain of existing in a space that actively defied his every intent. He stood in the center of the warping room, his peak radiant aura flickering, struggling to maintain its integrity against her pervasive, divine presence. The despair was no longer a creeping tendril. It was a suffocating shroud. This gap, it was impossible. He was a master, the pinnacle of the radiant path, and he was being treated like a novice, a child. His thoughts, as they always did in moments of profound, unbridgeable failure, turned to the impossible standard he carried, the ghost that lived in his name, the original Arthur. He would have known what to do. The thought was a bitter, corrosive self-indictment. He wouldn't be trapped in this psychic dollhouse. He wouldn't be confused by shifting physics. Arthur tried to imagine the legend, the hero who had built an empire and faced down gods, in this same scenario. The image that formed in his mind was one of absolute, unwavering authority. OG Arthur wouldn't be defending. His internal monologue whispered, laced with a familiar, toxic self-loathing. He would be dictating. His will was a force of nature. He would have imposed his own reality on this place. He would have seen through her games, shattered this conceptual prison with a single, focused application of his own will. He would have faced her, a god, as an equal. The comparison was a crushing weight. It amplified every failure, magnified every one of Alisara's effortless counters. He would have been strong enough. He would have found a way. But I am not him. I am just a pale shadow, a flawed echo failing to live up to the legacy. And she knows it. That was the worst part. He looked at the Emma projection, which was now sitting calmly in the armchair by the fire, watching him struggle as if he were a particularly frustrating piece of performance art. She knew. Her disappointment in him wasn't just a taunt. It was a genuine assessment. She had expected the legend, and she had gotten him instead. This vortex of despair was the real prison. His power, tied to his will, his intent, began to flicker, destabilized by his own profound self-doubt. Alisara, or the Emma projection, smiled, sensing his internal spiral, the cracking of his resolve. Yes, she purred, her voice dripping with a mix of pity and triumph. You see it now, don't you? The futility, the gap. You could have been so much more, Arthur. You could have been him, but you settled. You burdened yourself with attachments, with sentiment. She rose from the chair and glided towards him, the tilting, impossible room seeming to steady around her, her control absolute. But do not despair. It is not too late. You cannot reach that height on your own. But I can give it to you. I can break you down, burn away the weakness, and remake you. I can forge you into the man you were always meant to be. She stood before him, her hand reaching out, radiating an overwhelming, divine power. The illusory cottage dissolved, not violently, but fading away like a dream, the comforting warmth replaced by the cold, alien truth of the sanctum. She was done playing. Her hand, no longer Emma's, but her own, glowing with crimson light, moved towards his face. Let me help you, Arthur. Her true voice echoed, seductive and terrifying. Let me help you shed the skin. Let me break the flawed copy and find the original beneath. Her fingers brushed his temple. He was physically pinned by her reality control, his power suppressed, his mind lost in the suffocating shadow of the ghost he could never be. He was checkmated, trapped by an enemy who wielded his own deepest insecurities as her most potent weapon. I couldn't beat Alisara. The thought was a cold, absolute fact, a shard of ice in my mind that her power had solidified. I was trapped, pinned physically by her relentless, warping reality control, my peak radiant power feeling like a child's shout against her divine-level hurricane. The gilded cage of her fantasy, the one I had just shattered, had been replaced by a cruder, more honest prison of pure, overwhelming force. Her hand, radiating that chilling, possessive energy, was moving toward my face, her voice promising to break the flawed copy and find the original beneath. Despair was a heavy, suffocating shroud. The gap was just too much. The wall to divine rank, that shimmering, impossible barrier I had been striving towards, hovered just above me, intangible, unbreachable. And I was not strong enough at peak radiant to break her complete control. I had failed. Suddenly, the suffocating pressure of her sanctum vanished. The cold, alien architecture, the scent of roses and ozone, the overwhelming presence of Alisara, all of it dissolved. I was in a garden. No, not a garden. The scent was wrong. It was sharper, almost peppery. I was standing in an endless field of vibrant, cheerful yellow carnations, swaying gently under a sky of impossible blue. The warmth of a gentle sun touched my face. I knew this place. This was the mindscape, the conceptual space the original Arthur had pulled me into before. Hello again. We haven't talked in some time. A familiar voice reached my ears, calm and carrying, as if the wind itself spoke. I turned. My azure eyes met similar azure eyes. No, not similar. Identical. He stood there, the original Arthur, the one whose body I inhabited, looking exactly as I remembered, clad in simple, practical clothes, his gaze holding a quiet, unreadable intelligence. Arthur? I said, the name feeling strange on my own tongue, addressed to another. You brought me here. It wasn't a question. I recognized the subtle shift, the feeling of temporal distortion. This was his space, his control. A mindscape, I realized, the thought coming with a sharp pang of bitter irony, where even a second can stretch for nearly forever, just like hers. So I had breathing room, not freedom, just a different cage. Yes, he nodded, his expression calm. 3 years, has it been? 5 since we had a proper meeting. I corrected him, my voice sharper than I intended, the desperation and humiliation from the failing battle still fresh, curdling into a raw, biting anger. Just before I trained under your direction, in Zirian Prime. I took a step towards him, the soft petals of the carnations brushing against my legs. You haven't guided me? I pointed out, the words lashing out, seeking a target for my frustration. Not really. Not since the beginning. And this is the result. I gestured to myself, to the lingering psychic echo of Alisara's power, to the absolute, unwinnable situation outside this flowery prison. A bitter scoff escaped my lips. It's refreshing to have you be like this, original Arthur pointed out, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. Honest. Angry. It's an improvement. I narrowed my eyes at him, the rage mounting. Tell me now, Arthur, why did you bring me to this world? Why did you pull me here? My voice was rising, losing its careful control. You are a regressor, are you not? Someone with the knowledge, the experience, the power of a life already lived. So why did you need me? Why did you need a smart boy from a planet with no mana, no miasma, no concept of this madness? Why replace yourself with a flawed copy, a weaker substitute? He paused, his gaze never leaving mine, his calm infuriating. He looked at me, his identical eyes narrowing slightly, as if reassessing me. Then he bent down, brushing his fingers against one of the vibrant yellow flowers. What is this flower? He asked, his voice quiet. The abrupt shift in topic was jarring. They're yellow carnations, I replied, my voice still tight. Yes, he nodded, plucking one, observing it. And what do they symbolize? Disdain, I responded instantly, the answer coming from some forgotten fragment of my old life. Rejection, disappointment. I don't know what that has to do with. Disdain and disappointment, OG Arthur said, cutting me off, his voice firm. He held the flower up between us. Do not lie to yourself, Arthur. Lie to myself? I asked, confused and angry. About what? About your weakness, he said, shaking his head slightly. Or rather, about your perception of it. I did enjoy your humility for a time. It drove you to get stronger, to question, to grow. But do you truly think, even now, that you are weak? I blinked, the question catching me off guard. Objectively, no, of course not. I was a peak radiant. My power, my skills, my control. I was confident I could give a good, hard fight to any standard divine ranker, perhaps even find an edge against one of the demon lords or great seven leaders. But the thought soured instantly. That's the lie, isn't it? I thought, the internal monologue returning, the one Alisara had exploited so perfectly. Objectively strong, yes. But measured against him? He's a regressor. He's lived this life before. He would be so much stronger than I am at this same age. He would have planned for Alisara. He would have already reached divine rank probably years ago. I am a failure, hopelessly behind the curve he set. A pale imitation. My silence, my internal conflict, must have been clear on my face. OG Arthur just observed me for a long moment, his gaze analytical. Then, in a motion that shattered my understanding of our entire dynamic, he bowed. A full, formal, respectful bow, his head lowered. My eyes widened in pure, unadulterable shock. What are you saying? I stammered, taking an involuntary step back. What are you doing? This is my fault. Not why dash. No, he said, straightening, his expression now one of profound, weary seriousness. This is my fault. I apologize to you, Arthur Nightingale. I don't understand. When we first met in Vrindal, he explained, his voice losing its detached, instructive tone. I chastised you. I called you weak, arrogant, blind. I did it because I needed you to be more humble, to realize your weaknesses, because you were holding yourself back. Not just with the soul aspect, which was not your fault, but by getting comfortable in your position. You were starting to think of yourself as a peerless genius like Lucifer or Jack. You were limiting your own growth, which is why I went off on you. He chuckled, a short, dry, self-deprecating sound. And I would be lying if I said I wasn't a bit disappointed in you back then. My expectations were unfairly high. What's the point you are making? I asked, my mind reeling, trying to process this confession. He smiled, a different smile this time, tinged with a genuine, almost paternal warmth. The point is, from that moment onwards, Arthur Nightingale, you have never, not once, disappointed me in your strength. After the well of miasma, there was never anything to truly complain about. When we met in Avalon after the attack, when I convinced you to go to Zirian Prime, even then, I was not disappointed in your power, only your hesitation. He shrugged. In truth, even without Zirian Prime, you perhaps would have achieved the same results on your own. You are just that relentless. What? I asked, the single word hoarse. He stepped closer, his gaze intense, his hand coming up to poke me firmly in the chest, right over my sword heart. You are holding yourself back, Arthur Nightingale. Right now, in that fight, you are holding back because you are chasing a ghost. You are measuring yourself against a legend that you, yourself, have created. He poked me again, harder, emphasizing each word. You have surpassed me at my peak. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's not possible. You're a regressor. You knew everything. I knew a path, he countered, his voice rising for the first time, not in anger, but in passionate conviction. A flawed path that led to failure, a path that ended with my world in ashes. And who do you think you are fighting out there? Alisara, a divine being who can play with multiple demon lords at the same time, and you are surviving against her. You broke her fantasies. You landed blows, all without even reaching divine rank yourself. He stepped back, his chest heaving slightly, his azure eyes blazing with a fire I had never seen in him. Do you have any idea what you are? You wield three gifts not just as tools, but as a perfect, harmonious synthesis, a feat I never achieved. And you have the gray. He said the word with something approaching awe. A power that has never existed before in all of creation. A power that forced the Akashic records, the very chronicle of all existence, to create a new entry just to comprehend you. He looked at me, the arrogant, all-knowing mentor completely gone, replaced by a predecessor humbled and awestruck. You are not a copy, Arthur. You are not a replacement. You are not a flawed echo. You are an anomaly. You are a new variable that the universe and I never saw coming. You are holding yourself back because you think you are my shadow, when the truth is, I was never anything more than the groundwork for you. His smile returned, faint, and full of a profound, shattering respect. You are the one who has surpassed me. You are the true hope. You are the one, Arthur Nightingale, I could never compare to. My mind, my soul, the very foundations of my self-doubt, fractured. The limiting belief I had held on to, the subconscious, crippling idea that I was just a substitute, shattered into a million pieces. The ghost was gone, and in the silence of the sun-drenched field of carnations, I finally, truly saw myself. The sun-drenched field of yellow carnations, the impossible blue sky, the weight of the original Arthur's final, shattering words. You are the true hope, the one I could never compare to, dissolved. My consciousness, now clear, focused, and fundamentally, irrevocably changed, slammed back into my physical body with the force of a tidal wave. I was back in the cold, alien sanctum. The reality of my situation had not changed. I was still physically pinned, bound by a cocoon of crimson threads woven through warped space, just as I was before my mind was pulled away. Alisara's divine presence, a suffocating, possessive weight of complete control, still dominated the very air I breathed. I was still trapped, but my mind was, for the first time, truly free. The shadow of the original Arthur, the crippling subconscious belief that I was a lesser, flawed copy, had been obliterated, exposed as the very lie that held me back. I now saw with absolute, chilling clarity. My path was not to follow OG Arthur, but to surpass him by embracing the very things that made me different. Alisara, sensing my returned consciousness and the profound, jarring shift in my spiritual signature, renewed her assault. Her mental voice, no longer holding back its cold fury, purred directly into my mind. Awake already? Done visiting with your ghosts? It doesn't matter. You see the truth now, don't you, Arthur? He couldn't win, and neither can you. Accept your place. Her conceptual power surged. The crimson threads tightened. A spike of pure, crushing reality control aimed at extinguishing the new, defiant light in my soul. The last vestiges of her fantasy construct pressed in, aiming to finally break my will, to force my submission. No, I thought, the single quote not a whisper of defiance, but a simple, absolute statement of fact. I was still bound. I still couldn't match her raw power. But now I understood my path. I didn't need to break her control. I needed to understand it. I activated my gift, soul resonance. Before, my attempts to use it on Alisara had failed. Her divine, complex power, a fusion of innate control and stolen divinity, had actively warped my gift's influence, turning it back on itself, just as she had done to Lucifer's physical attack. And I now realized my own internal block, my crippling self-doubt, had kept me from ever truly focusing it with the intent of an equal, a true peer. Now, with my mind clear and my will absolute, I focused my soul resonance again. I did not try to attack her. I did not try to defend. I simply listened. I opened my conceptual senses, my new, unshackled while pushing through her divine interference, and aimed to copy the very blueprint of her complete control. It was an act of immense, terrifying danger. My consciousness was instantly, violently flooded. It was not her raw power, but the structure of it. I felt the cold, precise, geometric logic of her innate reality control, the math behind the crimson threads, the complex equations governing her spatial warps. And woven through it, a chaotic, seductive, passionate, stolen torrent, the very essence of Lysantra's fantasy, the concept of lust and possessive desire. I saw the fusion. I saw how the cold logic gave structure to the hot chaos, and how the chaos fueled the mundane control with divine, reality-bending power. I was inundated with her obsession, her madness, her twisted, possessive love for me, her memory of Emma. It was a psychic storm designed to annihilate any mind that touched it, to absorb any consciousness into her own. But my mind was no longer just my own. It was anchored by the objective, unfeeling truth of the gray. It was stabilized by the perfect, unshakable balance of lucent harmony. My will, forged in that field of carnations, held steady. I was not consumed. I learned. I had the blueprint. My turn, I thought. I was still pinned. My body was still her prisoner. But my mind, my soul began to write. I activated my other unique gift, Mythweaver. Alisara sensed the shift, this new, dangerous, and utterly alien resonance humming from her captive. Her threads tightened, a final spike of pure, crushing reality control aimed at extinguishing me before this, whatever it was, could complete. But it was too high, too late. I was no longer just a peak radiant. I was a creator, and I had just stolen the schematics. I began to forge my divinity. I used Mythweaver not to tell a story, but to write a new, fundamental law onto my own soul. I needed ink, a medium, and a grammar. I used the gray, the power from outside the Akashic records, the very concept of objective, unchangeable truth, as my ink. I used lucent harmony, the fundamental law of balance, of a reality that must be stable, as my grammar. I used the copied divine blueprint from Soul Resonance as my template. But I was not building her cage. I was forging my key. Where her power said, "My fantasy is reality," my new core edict wrote, "Objective reality is absolute, and my will is its assertion." This synthesis, this impossible four-gift fusion of copying, writing, truth, and balance, was my breakthrough. It was not a surge of new, raw power. It was a profound, fundamental change in state. It was the shattering of the wall to divine rank. It was the birth of my unique gray divinity. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. My very perception of the world snapped into a higher resolution. The complex architecture of the universe, the strings of magic, the flow of causality, all became clear. The intricate, arcane pathways of ten-circle magic, previously an impossible, theoretical wall, now lay open before me, as simple and intuitive as breathing. My connection to my sword, to the very concept of the blade, deepened exponentially. It was no longer a state of accord, a mutual agreement with the world. It had evolved. It was now sword sovereignty, the understanding that my assertion of the cut was the world's law. And the prison around me ceased to exist. The crimson threads binding my body, manifestations of Alisara's subjective will, touched the new, quiet aura of my gray divinity, and dissolved, not with force, not with an explosion. They simply unraveled, their conceptual right to exist invalidated by the absolute, objective truth I now embodied. The lingering psychic assault, the fantasies, the whispers of despair, they hit my mind and shattered, like lies spoken to a being who could no longer perceive falsehood. I stood up. I was free. I floated in the center of her sanctum, the ambient pressure of her control no longer weighing me down, but parting around me, like water flowing around an unmovable, objective stone. Alisara, for the first time since our encounter began, showed genuine, profound shock. Her eyes widened, her serene mask of control shattering. Her power, her complete control, failed to reassert itself on me. She tried to warp the space around me, and the space refused, held stable by my divine harmony. She tried to lash me with new threads, and they dissolved feet from my body, sizzling into nothing as they entered my new conceptual domain. Her rules, her imposed reality had just met a new, higher law, the law of objective truth. Alisara stared, her shock lasting only a heartbeat. Then, it shattered, replaced not by the cold fury I expected, but by something far more terrifying, pure, unadulterated joy. Yes, she whispered, the sound a breathy, ecstatic sigh that echoed in my mind. Oh, Arthur, yes. A brilliant, radiant smile spread across her face, a smile of genuine, terrifying elation. Finally, she declared, her voice trembling with a passionate, possessive fervor. I knew it was in you. I knew you weren't a disappointment. I knew it. I just had to push you. Her elation was not that of a defeated foe. It was the joy of a master artisan who had finally seen her flawed masterpiece perfect itself. She saw my ascension not as her defeat, but as her ultimate victory. I was at last worthy of her obsession. Now, she declared, her eyes blazing with a new, terrifying light, her crimson silks swirling around her as her full, unbridled power was unleashed. Let us truly dance, my love. I looked at her, my azure eyes now calm, deep, and holding a coldness that mirrored her own, but was born of absolute certainty, not malice. I was divine. The real fight, the battle between her subjective, all-powerful fantasy and my absolute, objective truth, was about to begin. The sanctum was silent, but it was the silence of a held breath, of two fundamental, opposing truths occupying the same space. My new divinity had settled, a quiet, absolute coldness that was not of ice, but of objective fact. The crimson threads, the physical manifestations of her complete control, had dissolved, unable to maintain their imposed narrative in the face of my gray assertion. Alisara, for the first time, looked truly shocked. Her power, her complete control, had failed to reassert itself. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, stared at me as if seeing a ghost, or perhaps, seeing me for the very first time. The crushing divine pressure, her primary weapon, was still there, but it no longer pinned me. It parted around my new aura like water flowing around an unmoving stone. Her shock lasted only for a heartbeat. Then, it shattered, replaced not by the cold fury I expected, but by something far more terrifying, pure, unadulterated joy. Yes, she whispered, the sound a breathy, ecstatic sigh that echoed in my mind. Oh, Arthur, yes. A brilliant, radiant smile spread across her face, a smile of genuine, terrifying elation. Finally, you did it. You actually did it. You're divine. She laughed, a clear, musical sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of her sanctum. It was the laugh of someone who had just received the one gift they truly desired. I knew it was in you, she cried, her voice trembling with a passionate, possessive fervor. I knew you weren't a disappointment. I knew it. I just had to push you. Her elation wasn't that of a defeated foe. It was the joy of a master artisan who had finally seen her flawed masterpiece perfect itself. She saw my ascension not as her defeat, but as her ultimate victory. I was at last worthy of her obsession. Now, she declared, her eyes blazing with a new, terrifying light, her crimson silks swirling around her as her full, unbridled power, the true power of the universe's number 3, was unleashed. Let us truly dance, my love. She didn't wait. The fight began again, but on a level that dwarfed everything that had come before. This was not a test. This was a celebration. She threw her arms wide, and her complete control exploded outwards. The alien architecture of the sanctum dissolved. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it vanished, replaced by her objective fantasy made manifest. We were suddenly floating in a swirling cosmos of crimson nebulae and black stars. The floor beneath my feet became an endless, churning ocean of spectral, grasping hands, each one whispering temptations, each one tangibly real. She's not just warping reality anymore, I thought, my new divine senses processing the shift. She's replaced it. This is her internal world, given form, her domain. The ocean of hands surged up, attempting to grab me, to pull me down into a sea of her desire. I asserted my own, simpler truth. I used my gray divinity, fueled by harmony, and declared, I am standing on solid ground. A small, perfectly flat disk of gray, objective fact materialized beneath my feet. The grasping hands dissolved into smoke wherever they touched its edge, unable to maintain their existence in the face of my contrary, absolute assertion. Alisara laughed, delighted by the parry. From the crimson nebulae, she gestured. 1,000 crimson threads, now imbued with the full weight of her divine power, shot towards me, each one a reality-severing weapon designed to unmake my defenses. I met them. I extended my hand, not to block, but to learn. I activated soul resonance. The divine-level gift, no longer suppressed by my self-doubt or her conceptual interference, reached out. As the first thread neared, I didn't copy its substance. I copied its blueprint, its conceptual structure. I felt it all. Her innate reality control, the structure, the stolen lust/fantasy, the chaotic power, and her possessive intent, the command. I understood how it was made. She sent another volley, this one aimed to kill. I activated Mythweaver. I had the blueprint. I had the knowledge. Now I wrote. Using the gray as the ink of objective truth and harmony as the grammar of fundamental balance, I wrote a counter-edict, negation. My own threads, woven not of crimson desire but of pure, silver-gray negation, erupted from my outstretched hands. They didn't just block her attack. They met her crimson threads in the void, and where they touched, her threads unraveled, their conceptual integrity nullified, their imposed reality undone. Copying my power? Alisara cried out, her voice filled with ecstatic, almost manic glee. Oh, Arthur, you are magnificent. This is what I wanted. This is the partner I have been waiting for. She was loving this. She had finally found a playmate who understood the rules of her impossible game. The battle became a high-speed, silent conversation of conflicting concepts. She imposed her will. I asserted objective truth. She made the very space around me ignite, a fantasy of a star's core made real. I countered with an edict of absolute zero, my gray divinity draining the concept of heat from my immediate vicinity, encasing me in a perfect, safe bubble of stillness. She tried to trap my mind again, projecting a fantasy of my own failure, of my family dying. But my divine soul resonance, now active, saw the intent behind the illusion before it formed. I copied the conceptual form of her mental assault, and using Mythweaver, I rewrote its target, sending the overwhelming feeling of failure and loss right back at her. She faltered. For the first time, her perfect control wavered. She stumbled in the void, her hand flying to her temple, having been assaulted by her own twisted creation. Her shock was absolute. Through this exchange, through the data I copied with soul resonance, my new divine senses, amplified by the gray's inherent truth-seeking, found it. The flaw, the seam. OG Arthur had told me my unique gifts were the key, and he was right. Her complete control was not a seamless whole. It was a graft. It was her innate, cold, precise control, reality, forcibly fused with the chaotic, passionate, stolen lust, fantasy. Her obsessive, possessive desire for me was the unstable, emotional glue holding the two contradictory concepts together, and it was, therefore, her greatest, most profound vulnerability. I realized I couldn't win a battle of attrition. She was still Alisara. Her reserves of power were oceans to my lake. But I didn't need to overpower her. I just needed to cut one specific conceptual thread. I pressed the attack, focusing my will, my gray divinity, not on her, but on that seam. She felt my intent, her eyes widening in true, primal fear for the first time. Her power flared, desperately. She played her final, most desperate card. The crimson cosmos dissolved, replaced instantly by the perfect fantasy. The cottage, the fireplace, and Emma, standing before me, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands outstretched in a desperate plea. Arthur, no. Please. Her voice, a perfect echo of a lost life, cried out. Don't do this. It's me. It's us. This is our happiness. Don't throw it away. Don't kill me. My hand, crackling with the focused, conceptual power of my gray divine edict, froze. The agony of that moment was absolute. The face, the voice, the memory, the profound, aching loss of a life I never got to live. This was Alisara's last, most cruel attack, using the ghost of Emma as a human shield. I looked at the weeping, pleading projection. I felt the pain, the regret, the longing. I acknowledged it. I let the grief wash over me, the pain of that ancient loss. And then I let it pass. My gray divinity, anchored in objective truth, allowed me to see the illusion for what it was, not Emma, but a beautiful, perfect, tragic lie. "You are not her," I whispered, the words of final, agonizing acceptance, a farewell to a ghost. I chose my present. I chose Stella.
I chose my fiancée.
I chose the flawed, real, and desperate world that depended on me. My will became absolute, my mind clear of all doubt. I looked past the weeping fantasy, at the terrified, divine soul hiding behind it, at the unstable conceptual seam I had targeted. I readied the final, killing blow.